The day dawned gray over King's Landing, the clouds distant and ominous. The city below was still waking, its narrow streets and endless alleys coming to life with the shuffle of feet and the low murmur of business. From the balcony of the Red Keep, one could smell the brine of the Blackwater Bay, but also something harsher. The constant tang of too many people crammed within the city walls, the filth and the fear mingling below in the capital of the Seven Kingdoms. Sansa Stark stood at the balustrade, her hands set gently on the cool stone, her auburn hair caught in the faint breeze. She felt that tingling in her stomach she had come to recognize, that sense that her world was about to tip into something new and unknown. She was a girl who had once dreamed only of chivalry and handsome princes. She had spun stories in her mind of knights on noble steeds, of gallant rescues, of tournaments and feasts. But in King's Landing, all her dreams had unraveled. She had watched her father die, she had been betrothed to cruel Joffrey, had endured ridicule from the court, had spent years treading on eggshells in the Lannisters' den. Now everything was shifting again, and no amount of courtesy lessons or practiced smiles could steel her completely for what was to come. The atmosphere at the Red Keep was tense. The alliance being discussed was unusual. House Martell of Dorne, who for years had remained distant from the Iron Throne's politics, had come forward with a potential marriage match that both surprised and unsettled the entire court. It was unheard of to pair a young northern lady, daughter of the late Eddard Stark, with Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, a famous warrior and paramour to Illyria Sand. Yet the proposal had been made, had been entertained, and, as with all things, strategic advantage had won out. Cersei Lannister and Tywin Lannister desired Dorne's loyalty. The Martells wanted satisfaction for past grievances. A northern bride, especially the eldest daughter of House Stark, provided both political clout and a symbolic healing of old rifts. Or so it was said. Sansa had never met Oberyn Martell until 3 days before the wedding was announced. She only knew of him through court whispers, dangerous, sharp-tongued, with a certain wickedness in his smile. He was older than she was by many years, certainly older than Joffrey, older than Willis Tyrell, who had once been suggested as a match for her, and older than Tyrion Lannister, to whom she had been briefly married in name if not in truth. This new arrangement had dissolved that last betrothal, or so the royals insisted. After all, the power of the Iron Throne could rewrite vows if it served the realm's political convenience. Sansa did not know how to feel. Fear lingered in her, but it was a different brand of fear than she had felt under Joffrey's cruelty. Oberyn's eyes were sharp and assessing, but not unkind. He looked at her with an intensity that made her blush, yet somehow made her feel safer than she had in years, though it was not a gentle safety, nor an innocent one. A restlessness lived behind his dark gaze. She had wondered if he bore resentment toward her, since her father had been Warden of the North under King Robert Baratheon, a king who had done nothing to avenge Princess Alya's death. But if Oberyn felt bitterness, he did not show it, nor did he ever speak ill of her father. Sansa perceived a slight edge in his tone whenever history was brought up, but he always carried it off with a certain roguish humor, as if to hide his deeper passions behind a sly grin. She stood on the balcony, waiting for dawn to give the city color, waiting for a new day in which her fate seemed once more not her own. Her thoughts were a turmoil of hope and dread. Would this marriage be a chain or a key to freedom? She turned abruptly to the interior of her chambers. The furnishings were lavish, far grander than what she had once had in Winterfell, but she had grown to dislike the opulence. It felt as though every tapestry's thread concealed a listening ear. She wore a gown of pale silver, chosen by Cersei's tailors as though to accentuate Sansa's ghostly presence in the Red Keep. Young and fair, living in the shadow of so many tragedies, she still found it strange that all her decisions seemed to be made by others. A knock at the door startled her. Ser Meryn Trant stepped in, face devoid of warmth. "They're ready for you in the courtyard," he announced. She nodded, gathering her composure. Her heart galloped in her chest, but she kept her chin lifted. She had learned to mask her feelings behind a poised courtesy. "Thank you," she said quietly. As she left the room, the corridor seemed heavier than usual, patrolled by Lannister guards. Each set of eyes that turned her way felt like a weight pressing upon her, judging her, pitying her, or worse, awaiting her misstep. She slipped into the day's ritual, crossing the castle to the inner courtyard where Lord Tywin Lannister, the King's Hand, was to meet with the Dornish retinue. The courtyard was awash with the red and gold of Lannister banners, and the orange sun and spear sigil of House Martell. Servants scurried with pitchers and trays, the steam of spiced wine curling into the crisp morning air. The heat of Dorne was a rumor carried on the garb of the guests. Men and women in flowing silks, some with gold armbands shaped like coiled serpents. Then there was Oberyn Martell, tall and lean, his smile slow and dangerous as he spoke with the assembled lords. He wore a coat of deep yellow embroidered with red serpents twisting across the fabric, and his belt buckle gleamed in the shape of a golden scorpion. He gave Sansa a polite bow when she arrived, but his eyes sparkled with something beyond mere courtesy. Lord Tywin cast a cold glance at Sansa. "Good. The bride has arrived. This is your intended, Prince Oberyn." The subtle sarcasm in his voice did not escape her. She realized that Tywin never liked any arrangement that he did not fully orchestrate. In this matter, Dorne held some of the cards, and Tywin Lannister disliked that. Still, he was a master of his own bearing, his expression unreadable. Oberyn took a step closer. He was, to Sansa's eyes, more imposing than she remembered from their first meeting. His presence was fiery, an undercurrent of tension in his limbs, as if he might burst into action at any moment. Yet his voice was low and smooth when he said, "Lady Sansa, you are as lovely as the morning. I trust you are well." Sansa offered him a small curtsy, the reflex from her years at court. "I am well enough, my lord." He smiled at her formality. "I hope in Dorne you will see warmer days, my lady. The climate, the people, life is different there. Perhaps it will please you more than King's Landing." It was hard not to stare at him. Everything about Oberyn was foreign to her. His accent, his clothing, his manner of carrying himself. His reputation hung over him like a cloak. The Viper from the south, a man of passions and violence, rumored to have fathered many daughters, rumored to have killed more than a few men in duels. Yet his courtesy was genuine at this moment, enough that she felt a shiver of cautious anticipation. A hush settled over the courtyard as King Tommen arrived, flanked by his Kingsguard. The boy king was far kinder than Joffrey had ever been, but he was still a boy, uncertain in the presence of men like Tywin Lannister and Oberyn Martell. They made an odd picture. The boy king standing before a circle of courtiers and the bride and groom that the realm's politics had contrived to join. Sansa felt heartsick, thinking of how different everything might have been. But she kept her composure, wearing the face she had learned to wear. With a small cough, Tommen delivered a prepared address. "We gather to witness the binding of House Martell and House Stark under the blessings of the Seven. May this union bring peace and prosperity to the realm." His voice wavered slightly. He looked uncomfortable repeating the official words. Sansa felt a tug of pity for him, a child forced to play at kingship. Oberyn took that moment to draw near to her and gently press a kiss to her knuckles. His lips were warm, the gesture surprisingly gentle. Sansa's face flushed. This was not the perfunctory, chilly courtesy she had expected. When he lifted his head, he offered her a small, private smile. "My lady," he murmured. She could not form words, only nod. The alliance had begun. They were to be wed in a fortnight. Rumors flew around the court like startled birds. Some whispered that Oberyn was seeking to further humiliate the Lannisters by wedding Ned Stark's daughter. Others said he had grown weary of King's Landing and saw in Sansa a chance to strengthen Dorne's claim should the realm be plunged into war again. Still others insisted that Oberyn possessed a sense of honor left unresolved after the murder of his sister, Elia, and that he would treat Sansa with more kindness than any might guess. Sansa, for her part, was left to guess where Ellaria Sand stood in all this. Oberyn's paramour was known to the court, and the two had arrived together. Ellaria was not the type to step aside meekly. Indeed, she had her own opinions on the matter, none of which were voiced openly in the presence of the Lannisters. Sansa sometimes felt Ellaria's eyes on her, though not with malice. It was more a curiosity, an appraisal, as if Ilaria was trying to see beyond the girl's stiff posture and find the beating heart beneath. It was on the 4th day after the announcement, once the official betrothal ceremony had concluded, that Sansa found Oberyn waiting for her in the castle gardens at dusk. She had been restless, unable to sleep, and had wandered out in a borrowed cloak. A swirl of moths floated around the lanterns set among the rose bushes, and the air carried the perfume of night-blooming flowers. She almost jumped when she saw a silhouette by the far fountain, tall and still. "My prince," she said softly, once she recognized him. He half turned, the lantern light reflecting off the planes of his face. "My lady," he gestured to the bench beside him. "Will you sit?" She approached warily. Though she was no longer that naive girl who came to King's Landing full of romantic dreams, she was still unaccustomed to being alone with a man like Oberyn Martell under such intimate circumstances. She sat, clasping her hands in her lap. For a time he said nothing, and the hush of the garden enveloped them. Sansa could feel the weight of unspoken things. Her father's murder, Oberyn's thirst for justice, the entire realm's precarious balance. At length, Oberyn spoke, his tone quieter than she expected. "I wish to speak to you without the eyes of the court upon us. You must have questions." Sansa felt her cheeks warm. Questions? Yes, she had an endless supply. "You must know, my lord, that I never asked for any of this." Oberyn inclined his head. "I know. Neither did I. The crown proposed this match, and my brother Doran saw advantage in it. He has his reasons, I have mine. Yet I do not wish you to think me cruel or indifferent to what you must feel." He paused. "I cannot change the course of fate that has brought us here, but I can try to make our path forward more bearable. Even, perhaps, to make it something better than bearable. You have suffered enough in this city." She thought of Joffrey, of the days she had been forced to stand in court while he tormented her. She remembered being made to marry Tyrion, though Tyrion himself had tried to be kind within the narrow confines of that union. She recalled her father's head on a spike. Her voice caught in her throat. "My father," she began, but the words trailed off. Oberyn's expression hardened. "He did not deserve what was done to him. That much we can agree upon. There has been too much death and tragedy in these 7 kingdoms." She nodded, biting her lip to hold back tears. It felt almost like a betrayal of her family that she was now being married off to some other powerful house without their consent. But she told herself that fate had left her few choices. The memory of her mother, her sister, her brothers, they all seemed so far away. "Would we live in Dorne?" she asked, hesitating over the question. For she had heard many times that Oberyn rarely stayed in one place for long. A slow grin tugged at his lips, though not unkindly. "Yes, eventually. My brother, Prince Doran, is not in the best of health. The water gardens are more his place than the Sunspear courts. I find that I travel often, but Dorne is my home, and I would have you see it if you wish." Sansa swallowed. Dorne was as distant as the moon to her, a place of desert heat and shimmering sands, of exotic customs and freer laws about love. But it was also far from King's Landing, far from the Lannisters. For that reason alone, part of her yearned to go. "Thank you, my lord." He studied her a moment longer, his dark eyes hinting at truths unspoken. Finally, he said, "I know you are frightened. I promise you, you will not find in me another Joffrey." His voice dropped to a lower register. "Yet, I am not a man of the North. I am not your father's friend, nor your brother's. My ways may seem strange. My sense of justice may seem no less ferocious than the Lannisters, but I direct it differently. If you become my wife, you become part of House Martell. That is not a trifling thing in the 7 kingdoms." She drew a trembling breath. "I understand, or I will try to." He nodded. In the silence, a nightingale's song drifted through the garden, and a swirl of orange lantern light caught in the fountains, creating the illusion of dancing flames on the water's surface. Sansa felt a strange calm stirring in her. Perhaps it was the knowledge that Oberyn was not as monstrous as she had feared, that he was not a man who took pleasure in torment. Or perhaps it was simply that she had grown so used to living in dread that this new uncertainty offered a faint spark of hope. Before leaving, Oberyn gently brushed his knuckles against her cheek, a gesture so unexpected that she froze. "We shall speak again soon," he promised. Then he rose and vanished into the garden's shadows, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the quiet pulse of possibility. In the days that followed, Sansa was caught in a swirl of preparations for the wedding ceremony. The memory of that moonlit conversation in the garden lingered in her mind, drawing conflicting emotions: curiosity, apprehension, and a surprising sense of warmth. She found herself almost eager for the day to pass quickly, if only to escape the stifling presence of the Lannisters. The seamstresses arrived, fussing with her measurements, adjusting lace and Myrish silks. Cersei had her own opinions on the cut of the gown, but Olenna Tyrell, still lingering at court, made a brief, sardonic visit and declared that Sansa should wear something that would turn the Martell snake's head. Sansa did not know whether to be flattered or mortified by the suggestion, but the Queen of Thorns spoke with a wise and sarcastic tongue that cut the Lannister seamstresses to ribbons of confusion, leaving Sansa with a dress that was, at the very least, not the color of Lannister gold. Instead, it was a creamy pale hue that offset her auburn hair, lined with a gentle saffron trim, a nod, perhaps, to the colors of Dorne. She had few friendly faces around her as the day approached. Shae was long gone, and Margaery Tyrell found herself entangled in her own issues, though she did manage a moment to squeeze Sansa's hands and offer a half-hearted reassurance that this might prove better than any alternative with the Lannisters. Sansa only smiled gratefully, uncertain if Margaery's optimism was genuine or merely a polished courtly courtesy. On the morning of the wedding, she was led to the royal sept, her heart hammering in her chest. The great September of Baelor had once seemed a grand place to her eyes, but now it loomed like a theater of nightmares. She recalled Joffrey and Margaery's wedding, the feast, the poison, the chaos that followed. Now she would stand where Margaery had once stood. Dorne's retinue had arrived in force. Doran Martell was not present. He remained in Sunspear, too frail for travel, but Oberyn's daughters, the Sand Snakes, were rumored to be in King's Landing. Sansa had caught glimpses of a few. Tall and fierce Obara, lithe and cunning Nymeria, dark-eyed Tyene with her sweet smile that belied a dangerous cunning. Illyria Sand moved among them with a certain regal confidence. And, of course, Oberyn was at their center, wearing gold and crimson, with the grace of a panther. He stood at the altar, awaiting Sansa, while the High Septon waited to preside over the ceremony. Sansa walked down the aisle on the arm of Ser Kevan Lannister, who had been chosen to give her away in the absence of any living male relative from House Stark. The moment felt surreal. She tried to hold her head high, ignoring the eyes upon her. She passed by familiar faces: Pycelle's vacant stare, Littlefinger's calculating smile, Varys's unreadable expression, Margaery's encouraging nod, Cersei's narrowed gaze. Finally, she reached Oberyn, whose expression was unusually sober, a veil of seriousness beneath which simmered his usual intensity. He took her hand. His grip was firm but not painful, and in his eyes she saw a promise. What promise she couldn't yet say. The High Septon began the ritual, intoning the prayers to the Seven, binding them in the eyes of gods and men. Sansa's voice trembled slightly when she repeated her vows, but she clung to her courage. Oberyn's voice was deep and steady, vibrating through the silent sept. When it came time to cloak her with the Martell colors, he draped a rich cloth of red and orange over her shoulders. A hush fell across the crowd. In that moment, she felt the finality of it. Sansa Stark, once of the North, now a bride of Dorne. She felt lightheaded, but in a sudden moment of clarity, she also felt a spark of relief. This was at least not the future Joffrey had planned for her. Once the words were said, Oberyn leaned in. In front of the entire assemblage, he pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her lips. The crowd watched. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she did not resist. He whispered against her lips, "My lady wife." Then applause erupted, echoing in the high arches of the sept, though it was a careful applause. Some clapped politely, others did so with tight-lipped reluctance. The wedding was done. She was a Martell princess by law now, for though Oberyn was not the ruling prince of Dorne, he was still royalty in his own right, brother to Doran, uncle to the heirs of that domain. They were escorted to a great feast in the throne room. King Tommen welcomed them officially, though again the boy's words sounded rehearsed. The tension in the room was palpable, for House Martell had long held grievances against the Lannisters. Yet there was no outright hostility. The day demanded courtesy. Oberyn and Illyria sat with Sansa at the high table, drinking from jeweled cups of Dornish red. Servants brought trays of spiced dishes from Dorne, alongside more traditional fare from King's Landing. The unfamiliar scents and tastes left Sansa's palate tingling. Cinnamon, cumin, fiery peppers. She noticed how Illyria leaned in occasionally to whisper something to Oberyn, how the two would smile at some private jest. It gave Sansa a strange pang in her stomach. She was not jealous, exactly, but the sight reminded her of all she did not yet know about her new husband. When Oberyn turned to her, he was gracious enough to offer tidbits about the food, telling her of the water guard, and explaining some of the traditions of Dorne. She listened, intrigued, though her heart beat quickly in this unfamiliar realm of social interplay. She was his wife now, but Illyria was something else, an ever-present piece of Oberyn's life that Sansa knew she could not ignore. After the feast, the crowd expected the bedding ceremony. A hush fell. In the past, such ceremonies could be lewd and humiliating. Sansa had dreaded it during her forced marriage to Tyrion. But before anyone could make a rowdy suggestion, Oberyn stood, holding up a hand. "I believe," he said, voice resonating through the hall, "that in Dorne we follow our own customs. My wife and I will retire without the need for further spectacle." His eyes flickered to Tywin Lannister, challenging him to object. Tywin said nothing, and the tension in the hall lingered for a beat. Then Oberyn held out his hand to Sansa, and she rose, letting him lead her away from the throng. She tried not to tremble. Behind them, music struck up again, and the chatter resumed. But she felt 100 eyes at her back as they walked from the throne room, the cloak of Martell colors trailing behind her, her hand in Oberyn's. He led her to a suite in Maegor's Holdfast, newly prepared for their wedding night. Sansa's breath came shallow in her chest. The door shut behind them with a quiet click that sounded far louder to her than it should have. The chamber was lit by scores of candles, and the bed was draped in linens embroidered with Martell suns and spears. She stood in the center, uncertain, the silence all-consuming. Oberyn looked at her with a gentleness she had not expected to see. "My lady," he said, approaching slowly, "you have no cause to be afraid of me." She tried to still the trembling in her hands. She thought she had prepared herself for this, but fear was a stubborn creature, lodged in her from years of living in a viper's nest of another sort. She managed a small, shaky smile. "I know," she whispered. He reached out, resting a hand lightly on her forearm. "I will not force you to do anything you do not desire. We can pass this night quietly. It is enough that the realm sees us wedded." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she felt foolish for it. Perhaps she had expected him to be rough and demanding, to take advantage of her new vulnerability. Instead, he was speaking with gentle reassurance. The tension in her body slowly eased. She looked up at him, seeing lines of age and experience in his face, a trace of sadness behind his confidence. She could almost glimpse the man who had lost a sister to violence, who had fought for vengeance for years. "I'm sorry," she whispered, unsure of what she was apologizing for, maybe for her inexperience or for her fear, or for the events that led them both to this. He shook his head. Then, in a calm, measured tone, he offered to pour her wine. She nodded, and he moved to a small table where a carafe of Dornish red sat, along with 2 cups. He poured, and the air was scented with spices. Handing her 1 cup, he raised his own in a silent toast. Sansa sipped, feeling warmth spread through her throat. The wine was strong, almost heady in its flavor, but the effect was strangely soothing. "I have heard you sing," Oberyn said after a time, surprising her. You have? She asked. He nodded. The court is a place of many ears. They say the little dove has a gentle voice. I've never had the pleasure of hearing it myself. She blushed, remembering how she used to sing for Joffrey's entertainment, to avoid angering him. I've not sung in a while. Her voice had been lost amidst so many tragedies. His gaze was steady. Maybe one day, when you are ready, I will hear it, without the shadow of cruelty or fear. The unexpected kindness made her throat tighten. The night passed in that tone, with quiet conversation and sips of wine. Eventually, she felt the fatigue of the day's events pressing down on her. Oberyn rose and blew out some of the candles, leaving the room in a softer glow. With a delicate mixture of formality and warmth, he guided her to the bed. She allowed him to help her out of her heavy wedding cloak, and she unfastened the intricate laces of her gown, her face turned away in modesty. He placed a hand upon her shoulder, a silent question. She nodded faintly, carefully, gently. He lifted the dress, leaving her in her shift. He took his time removing his own garments, ensuring he did not rush her into anything. When he finally lay beside her, it was without urgency. Sansa felt her pulse hammering, but she managed to meet his gaze. She allowed him to stroke her hair softly, a gesture more comforting than arousing, and she found that she could breathe easier in his presence. If anything more happened that night, it was not a tale of rough conquest. It was tentative, measured, a conversation of soft touches and whispered words that might have seemed surprising coming from the Red Viper of Dorne. And when at last Sansa closed her eyes in the darkness, she felt something akin to gratitude, a cautious hope that her new husband was no monster after all. In the aftermath of the wedding, the realm resumed its endless game of politics. Whispers followed Sansa wherever she went in the Red Keep. Some said the marriage was purely a strategic move for House Martell. Others suggested Oberyn had found a new plaything. There were more sympathetic murmurs too, from those who remembered her father's fate and took pity on the young woman who seemed once again a pawn in the great game. Through it all, Sansa strove to maintain her composure. She was now Sansa Martell in the eyes of the court, though her northern heritage remained essential to her identity. She found herself spending more time with Ellaria Sand than she might have expected. Ellaria was a worldly woman, possessed of a confidence that sometimes startled Sansa with its candor. Early one morning, Sansa encountered her in the castle library, scanning through tomes on the history of Dorne. Surprised to find the paramour of Oberyn Martell delving into old histories, Sansa paused, uncertain whether to approach. But Ellaria spotted her and offered a smile. Curious about Dorne? Sansa ventured, noticing the volume in Ellaria's hands. Ellaria set the book aside. I know much of Dorne, of course, but it's interesting to see how these scribes in King's Landing record us, often with glaring bias. She laughed, a soft, throaty sound. Then she gestured to the chair beside her. Sit, Princess Sansa. I suppose I should call you that now. Sansa hesitated, but took the seat. She still felt shy being called princess by someone like Ellaria, who seemed so at ease in her own skin. Do you wish to learn more of your new home? Ellaria asked lightly. I can tell you truths that these old scrolls will not. The taste of Dornish peppers, the feel of warm sand underfoot, the color of the sky at sunset. Sansa realized she did long to know more, if only to prepare herself for the journey that might lie ahead. Yes, she said. I would like that. They spent a quiet hour in conversation, Ellaria describing the luscious fruit markets of Sunspear, the swirling colors of the Rhoyne River after heavy rains, the festivals that celebrated harvest and victory. She spoke of Oberyn with a fondness that was both sensual and admiring, describing his skill at arms, his devotion to family, his temper that could flare at a moment's notice. Sansa listened intently, gleaning glimpses of her husband's life that he had not yet shared with her. You must wonder, Sansa said at last, voice hushed, why Oberyn would marry me when he has you. Ellaria looked at her with sympathy. We are not like those in the west or the north. In Dorne, love can take many shapes. We do not cling to the same strict bounds of marriage that the rest of Westeros does." She regarded Sansa carefully. "But that is not to say your union is meaningless to him. Oberyn does not do things by half. If he's agreed to wed you, he intends to honor that." Sansa swallowed. She was beginning to see that the Dornish way allowed for complexities that might shock the other realms. She was not sure what that meant for her own life, her own heart. But Illyria's openness at least removed some of the fear Sansa had carried. She began to think that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement could offer her a future in which she was not forever a trembling pawn. Over the next few weeks, King's Landing began to feel stifling in a different way. Tywin Lannister tested Oberyn with subtle barbs, veiled suggestions that Dorne should comply with the crown's wishes in matters of trade and military support. Oberyn, never one to back down, met Tywin's manipulations with cunning or direct confrontation. Sansa watched from the sidelines as Oberyn's brand of diplomacy, sharp smiles and sharper words, collided with Tywin's cold brilliance. It was an uneasy dance. She sensed the risk in every conversation, for Oberyn's anger toward the Lannisters had not fully abated. If he saw an opening to avenge his sister, he might be reckless. One evening, Sansa found Oberyn pacing in their chambers, the windows open to let in a cool breeze. He was restless, the flicker of candlelight catching the gold in his rings and the dark length of his hair. She closed the door quietly behind her and stepped forward, summoning the courage to speak. "My lord," she said softly, "is something the matter?" He looked up, brow furrowed. "Tywin Lannister is trying to wring a promise from me that Dorne will send more men to the crown's wars if they should flare again. He wants to tie us down before we leave. But my brother has already determined the measure of our support. I am not the final authority on this matter. I came here to see if King's Landing would yield the truth about my sister's murderers. I thought that was Tyrion once, but after everything, it's clear the blame lies higher." His hands clenched, and Sansa realized how deeply the past weighed on him. She approached, placing a tentative hand on his arm. "I'm sorry. I know how it feels to want justice for your family." His eyes met hers, and some of the hardness receded. "Yes, you do. Perhaps that is why we are here, bound by these intricate strands of politics. You are a Stark, I am Martell. Two families that have felt the Lannisters' claws." She lowered her gaze. "I only wish I could do something. My family is scattered. My brother Robb is gone. I don't even know what became of my sister Arya. My little brothers." Her voice caught. The memory was too painful. Oberyn reached out, tilting her chin up gently. "You are not alone anymore," he said. "Dorne has taken you under its banner. I know it may feel strange, but you do have allies now." Something in his tone made her heart flutter with a renewed sense of belonging, however tenuous. She had never felt safe in King's Landing, not truly, but perhaps with Oberyn and the Dornish behind her, she might discover a measure of security. "Come," Oberyn said, letting out a breath as though trying to dispel his tension. "The night is cool, and I cannot abide these stuffy corridors any longer. Would you walk with me along the castle walls? The moon is bright." Sansa hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, my lord. Call me Oberyn," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We are husband and wife." The words sent a small thrill of nerves through her. She let him lead her out. Together, they climbed the winding stair that led to the ramparts overlooking Blackwater Bay. The city lights sprawled below, pinpricks of gold in the darkness. She gripped his arm for balance, the stone beneath her feet cold. The wind ruffled her cloak, carrying the briny smell of the sea. Up there, away from the courtly intrigues, Sansa felt more at ease. Oberyn pointed out the faint shadows on the horizon, ships moored beyond the bay, and the looming shape of Dragonstone in the far distance. He told her stories of the summer sea, of foreign lands he had visited in his youth. Sansa listened, letting the images wash over her mind, filling the emptiness of her own dashed hopes with something new, stories of adventure, possibility, danger tempered by curiosity. When their footsteps brought them to a secluded corner of the rampart, Oberyn turned to her, letting his hand rest on her waist. The moonlight caught the lines of his face. Sansa felt suddenly aware of how close they stood, of the new bond they shared. He leaned in and kissed her lightly, a gentle brush of his lips that nevertheless made her pulse race. For a moment, Sansa recalled that naive girl who had dreamed of kisses from golden-haired princes. Life had shattered those dreams. But now, in this quiet moment, the kiss of a dangerous Dornish prince was more honest than all the flattery she had once craved. She let herself accept it, responding with a softness born of tentative hope. Perhaps the future would remain uncertain, but she felt the stirrings of something stronger than fear. The next day arrived too swiftly, bringing with it a summons from the small council to discuss the finalization of Dorne's stance in the realm. Oberyn and Sansa attended together, entering the council chamber to find the usual suspects. Tywin Lannister presiding, Mace Tyrell smiling vacuously, Pycelle nodding off, Varys gliding about with studied politeness, and Cersei leaning against the table. The flicker of torches lit the polished wood and the metal of Tywin's rings. Sansa stood silently at Oberyn's side while he addressed Tywin. Their conversation was pointed, civil on the surface but rife with tension. Oberyn insisted on certain concessions for Dorne, better trade terms, autonomy for the Dornish armies in the event of new conflicts. Tywin responded with his measured demands, trying to corner Oberyn into pledging a certain number of spears to the crown should war erupt again. At one point, Tywin's cold gaze shifted to Sansa. "And what say you, Lady Sansa?" he asked, arching a brow. "You are, after all, the link between Dorne and the North. Perhaps you have an opinion on these matters." She swallowed, her mind racing. She had seldom been asked to speak on politics before, certainly never in the presence of men like Tywin. Part of her wanted to retreat into silence, but she felt Oberyn's gaze on her, quiet encouragement. She raised her chin. "I believe that if the crown truly wishes peace, it must show good faith to those regions that have been wronged in the past," she said, voice steady but soft. "Justice and respect are more effective at winning loyalties than demands." Tywin's eyes narrowed slightly. Justice is not always so simple, especially in the wake of rebellion and war. She did not flinch. "No, my lord, but it is necessary nonetheless." There was a moment of silence, pregnant with meaning. Then Cersei laughed softly, a mocking edge to her tone. "Quite the bold little dove you have there, Oberyn." He bared his teeth in a smile. "I do appreciate a lady with spirit. The North fosters strong women, does it not?" The meeting concluded with no final resolution, but Tywin did not press further that day. Oberyn led Sansa out, and as soon as they were away from prying eyes, he squeezed her hand in approval. "Well spoken," he murmured. She felt a surge of pride, small yet bright. That night, Oberyn, Ellaria, and Sansa dined together in a more private setting, in a lavish solar that overlooked the Blackwater. The conversation was fluid, unbound by the stiff protocols that dominated the court. Ellaria spoke of her daughters, recounting comedic mischief they had gotten into while exploring the city. Oberyn chimed in with witty remarks about the cautionary messages he had to relay to his fierce sand snakes, each one a budding fighter in her own right. Sansa listened, sometimes quietly, but she found herself smiling more often. There was a familial warmth that she had not expected to experience ever again, something reminiscent of her memories of Winterfell's great hall on feasting nights, though the dynamic here was entirely different. After the meal, Ellaria rose, sliding gracefully from her chair. "I'll leave you two for now," she said, placing a hand on Oberyn's shoulder and leaning down to press a kiss to his cheek. Then she offered Sansa a nod, something respectful and understanding. "Rest well, princess." When Ellaria was gone, Sansa looked to Oberyn, a question in her eyes. "Are you sure she's, comfortable with all of this?" "I do not wish to." He stopped her with a slight shake of his head. "Ellaria and I have an understanding that might be difficult to grasp if you are not of Dorne. She and I share love, yes, but we do not bind it with the laws of marriage as the rest of Westeros might expect. Her heart is her own." My heart is my own. We share what we share, and it changes nothing about the respect we hold for you." Sansa frowned, trying to piece it together. She had grown up on stories of knights and ladies, of exclusive and rigid marital bonds. But this arrangement was more fluid, acknowledging passions and affections in a way she had never considered. "I see," she said softly. She wasn't sure if she fully understood, but she believed him when he said it changed nothing of his respect for her. Over time, the new normal settled in. King's Landing continued its usual swirl of power plays, but Sansa found she had a measure of protection now. She accompanied Oberyn to court gatherings, forging a small presence of her own, learning more about the subtle inflections of speech that governed the corridors of power. She spent some afternoons with Illyria, forging a tentative friendship that was based on the shared knowledge of Oberyn's moods and the challenges that came with being in the Lannisters' capital. Yet all the while, Sansa sensed the building pressure. Oberyn did not intend to stay in King's Landing forever. The time would come, perhaps sooner than expected, when they would depart for Dorne. Part of her looked forward to that, to a new land where the Lannisters' ghosts did not loom so large. Another part of her was afraid. King's Landing was all she had known for many years, as horrible as that knowledge sometimes was. Dorne was a mystery, its climate, its customs, its court. She wondered how the Dornish people would receive her. Would they resent having a Stark as their prince's wife? Would she be an outsider, or would they embrace her? She confided these fears to Oberyn one evening, when they sat in their chambers, lanterns casting dancing shadows on the walls. He was removing his jewelry, a signet ring of a serpent coiling around a spear, and a slender gold earring he sometimes wore, when she asked him, "Will they hate me in Dorne?" He paused, looking over with a thoughtful expression. "Hate you? Why should they?" She shrugged, anxiety tightening her chest. "I'm from the north. I'm a reminder of alliances that once stood with the Iron Throne. I'm not Dornish." He set the jewelry aside and crossed the room, taking both her hands in his. "Dorne has a complex history, yes, and some will question you. But Dorne does not fear outsiders the way the North or the Westerlands might. We embraced the Rhoynar generations ago. We have made peace with Targaryens. We are a land of many influences, many passions. If you come openly, sincerely, and learn our ways, I believe they will come to admire you." She gazed at their joined hands, feeling a flicker of comfort at his confidence in her. "I will do my best." He smiled. That is all anyone can ask. Just as she began to find her footing, the coronation anniversary of King Tommen arrived, a lavish affair. The Red Keep was dressed in Lannister gold and Baratheon stag ba. Nurs. Feast tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, candied fruits, honey cakes, and enough wine to fill 1,000 cups. Courtiers from across Westeros flocked to the city, swelling its population, bringing with them news, gossip, and tensions. Sansa caught rumors of the Ironborn stirring in the west, of the Vale rising under Little Lord Robert, of the Riverlands grappling with bandits and broken men. The realm was far from stable. Oberyn, ever the spectacle, entered the hall at Sansa's side, wearing a coat of burnished orange embroidered with golden vipers. At a glance from him, she knew he was watchful, scanning the crowd for potential threats. Illyria joined them, wearing a daring gown that left little to the imagination. They turned many heads, but Sansa tried to compose herself, matching her husband's steady stride. The eyes of lords and ladies flickered to her, some in jealousy, some in fascination. She was, after all, the new lady of House Martell, the ex-prisoner of King's Landing. She saw Oberyn's sand snakes, scattered about the hall, their expressions vigilant. Before the night's festivities could devolve into drunken brawls, Tywin Lannister approached Oberyn with the slightest bow. "Prince Oberyn," he said in a clipped tone, "I would speak with you on a matter of some importance." Sansa, standing beside Oberyn, tensed. She felt the distrust roll off her husband like waves. But Oberyn nodded. "Very well," he said. "Shall we find a more private corner, Lord Tywin?" Tywin's face was inscrutable. "Yes, Lady Sansa," if you'll excuse us." She inclined her head, heart pounding. She hated not knowing what was transpiring. She stepped aside, letting them move to a curtained alcove. From across the hall, Marjorie Tyrell offered her a sympathetic glance. Sansa forced a faint smile, then found a seat. She waited, each minute feeling like an hour, thoughts spinning. Perhaps Tywin was going to push Oberyn to commit Dornish troops. Perhaps he would threaten him somehow. The unknown made her uneasy. After some time, Oberyn returned. His expression was grim. Sansa rose to meet him halfway. He leaned close, murmuring in her ear, "Tywin wants a guarantee that Dorne will not rise up against the Iron Throne if the realm faces another rebellion. He claims to have knowledge of certain elements in the north that might be of interest to you, but only if I concede to his demands." Her eyes widened. "What elements? My family?" He nodded solemnly. "Possibly. He says the Hound was seen traveling with a young girl of wolf's blood in the Riverlands. He all but insinuated it might be Arya. He's dangling that in front of me, hoping I'll sign away Dorne's freedom." Sansa's heart hammered. "Arya alive?" she breathed, tears threatening. "She might be out there alone?" Oberyn's jaw tightened. "He won't give me more than rumor unless I pledge Dorne's unconditional support. He wants me to sign an agreement that if the crown calls, the Dornish armies will fight without question." He let out a slow breath, fury simmering in his eyes. "Your sister's life, your hope, is not his to bargain with." Sansa felt a tear slip down her cheek. Anger and desperation warred in her. She had spent so long wondering if Arya had survived. The possibility that she was alive in the Riverlands was almost too much to bear. "What do we do?" she asked, voice trembling. He reached for her hand, speaking quietly so none could overhear. "We do not bend to Tywin's manipulations. That man thrives on fear and leverage. Cannot let Dorne be shackled. But perhaps we can find another way. I will send my own spies, or we can get information through other channels. Varys may be persuaded to help, for a price. But do not let Tywin's threats rule your heart. That is what he wants." She swallowed hard, nodding. She knew he spoke sense. Yet the thought of Arya alone, perhaps captured or in danger, tore at her. She had to trust Oberyn, had to trust that they could uncover the truth without falling into Tywin's trap. For the rest of the evening, Sansa went through the motions of revelry, dancing when asked, smiling at courtiers who offered stiff compliments. She felt Oberyn's presence at her side, and each time she looked at him, she saw the same anger hidden beneath his charismatic facade. As the hour grew late, she excused herself from the hall. She barely made it back to their chambers before tears overcame her. Oberyn followed soon after, finding her sitting on the edge of the bed, trembling with pent-up emotion. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "We'll find your sister," he vowed. "I do not say such words lightly." She believed him. In that moment, more than ever, she needed to. She let herself fall into his arms, seeking the warmth of his embrace. He was solid, unwavering, a far cry from the illusions of knighthood she had once idolized, but in some ways more real, more formidable. Days passed, and Oberyn began sending out feelers through contacts in the city's underbelly. He arranged coded messages to Dorne, instructing certain spies and merchants to keep their eyes open for a girl matching Arya's description. Sansa did not know the exact details. Oberyn insisted on secrecy, but she felt a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt that he was using his resources for her. She had never imagined that she might one day rely on the Red Viper of Dorne for help in finding her sister. In the midst of these uncertainties, the time finally came for Oberyn and his retinue to depart King's Landing for Dorne. They had fulfilled their obligations at court, the wedding had been finalized, and the presence of so many Dornish in King's Landing was no longer necessary. Tywin Lannister, for his part, seemed content to let them go, though he surely had his reasons. Perhaps he believed Oberyn would eventually bend to his demands from afar. Perhaps Tywin had other matters to address. Whatever the reason, the day arrived when Sansa found herself packing her belongings, preparing to leave the Red Keep. She felt a pang of nostalgia. For all the horrors, King's Landing had been her cage and her battlefield for years. Now, she would leave it behind, stepping into the unknown, heading south with her new husband and a court that might be friendlier than what she'd known. But still, the fear of the unknown tugged at her. She gazed one last time from the balcony where she had once stood, looking over the city of secrets and shattered dreams. She wondered if she would ever see it again. Oberyn joined her, placing a hand on the small of her back. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, turning away from the view. "Yes, I think so." He led her down to the courtyard, where a train of horses and carriages awaited. Dornish guards in light armor handled the baggage, while the sand snakes mounted their own steeds. Illyria offered Sansa a smile as she took her place in a gilded carriage. Sansa chose to ride on horseback, deciding she would not be the delicate lady in a carriage if she could help it. She wore a traveling cloak of pale linen, pinned at the shoulder with a Martell sun and spear brooch. The symbol felt alien and familiar all at once. She was a Stark by blood, but a Martell by marriage. As they rode out through the city gates, Sansa glanced back at the looming sprawl of King's Landing. She felt no love for it, only a wary farewell. With Oberyn at her side, she pressed forward, following the column as it snaked along the Rose Road, bound for the deserts and mountains of Dorne. The journey south took weeks, each league bringing new sights and climates. They passed through fields of golden wheat, rolling hills dotted with wildflowers, then into the rain-soaked plains where the air grew humid. At nights, they camped in enclaves of trees, or stayed in the keeps of lords who owed allegiance to House Martell or who wished to curry favor with it. Sansa found the travel both exhausting and enlightening. She saw how the southern lords greeted Oberyn, some with deference, others with guarded respect, a few with open admiration. She realized that House Martell inspired loyalty in ways the Lannisters could not comprehend. It was not simply fear but a sense of shared identity and pride. As the days passed, Oberyn and Sansa grew more comfortable with each other's presence. They talked at length about their families, their hopes, their regrets. She revealed stories of her childhood in Winterfell, playing in the snow with Arya, listening to old Nan's tales. He spoke of traveling to Essos, of tasting wines from far-off lands, of the heartbreak he felt upon losing his sister and the rage that still burned within him. Through these conversations, Sansa felt them forging a bond that transcended the forced nature of their marriage. She began to see him not just as the Red Viper, but as a man of layered complexities, capable of both ferocity and gentle devotion. By the time they reached the Prince's Pass, the climate had shifted drastically. The air was drier, the sun fiercer. The rocky terrain gave way to gnarled olive trees, prickly cacti, and the distinctive swirling patterns of sandstone. Sansa felt her skin prickle under the intense light, and she pulled her cloak closer, though it did little to shield her from the heat. The Dornishmen, including Oberyn, seemed invigorated by the climate change, sitting straighter in their saddles, breathing in the dry air as if it were a welcome friend. Finally, they arrived at Sunspear. The ancient seat of House Martell rose from the coast, a complex of towers and walls that seemed to shimmer under the relentless sun. Beyond it, the sea stretched out, a sparkling expanse of blue. Sails of trade ships bobbed in the harbor. The city around the castle bustled with life, a tapestry of skin tones, languages, and clothing styles that differed from anything Sansa had seen in King's Landing or the North. Trumpets sounded from the walls to announce their approach. The gates swung open, revealing courtyards lined with slender palm trees and mosaic-tiled paths. Dornish banners fluttered in the breeze. Sansa inhaled, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was to be her new home. A contingent of guards and courtiers awaited them. At their head was Prince Doran Martell himself, seated in a wheeled chair, his face sculpted in careful neutrality. He welcomed them with courteous words, expressing pleasure that his brother had returned with his new bride. Sansa dismounted, legs stiff from travel, and curtsied. Doran inclined his head, offering a formal greeting. "My Lady Sansa," he said, "welcome to Dorne." May it be a place of warmth and refuge for you after the travails you've endured." She thanked him, noting his measured tone and the intelligence shining in his eyes. Oberyn embraced his brother carefully, a slight tension in the moment. She sensed the swirl of family politics. Oberyn was the fiery warrior, Doran the cautious ruler, each with a different vision for how to handle Dorne's place in the realm. They were escorted into the great halls of Sunspear, where the stone floors were inlaid with colorful patterns. The ceilings were high, letting the heat rise, and a system of arched windows allowed for breezes from the sea. Servants offered cool water infused with citrus and mint. Sansa drank gratefully, feeling the dryness in her throat lessen. After the formal greetings, Oberyn showed her to the suite of rooms prepared for them. A series of chambers that caught the sea breeze, each richly decorated with Dornish textiles, pillows, and carved furniture. She stood at a balcony overlooking the harbor. The sunlight glinted off the water, and far in the distance, she could see the faint outlines of ships sailing toward the horizon. Oberyn joined her. "It will take time to adjust to the heat," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But soon you won't be able to imagine living in the dreariness of King's Landing." She felt a smile tug at her lips. "I can believe that." Then, turning to look at him, she added softly, "Thank you for everything. You gave me a chance to leave that place behind, and you promised to help find my sister. I haven't forgotten that." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I made a vow, and I keep my vows, especially those made to my wife." His eyes flickered with warmth. "Welcome to Dorne, my lady." In that moment, with the sound of gulls echoing over the harbor and the tang of salt in the warm air, Sansa Stark, now Sansa Martell, felt the faint stirrings of hope, a fragile but luminous thing. Her old life lay behind, full of ghosts and heartbreak. This new land offered no guarantees, but it offered possibility. She clung to that thought, letting herself believe that perhaps, against all odds, her story was not destined to be one of endless tragedy. Here, in the sun-soaked halls of Sunspear, she might find a future shaped by her own choices, and maybe even a measure of peace beside the Red Viper who had, in his own fierce way, chosen her as well. Sansa rose early on her first morning in Sunspear, awakened by the unfamiliar heat that seemed to embrace the castle walls long before dawn. She had grown used to the damp, clingy warmth of King's Landing in summer, but this was different. A dry, penetrating glow that settled on her skin and teased her to seek out shade. She pushed aside the gauzy bed curtains, stepping across cool tiled floors toward the balcony that overlooked the sea. The horizon was painted with pink and gold, reflecting off the still waters below, and a soft breeze carried the sharp tang of salt. She drew a breath that filled her lungs with something clean, something like hope. Oberyn was not in bed. More often than not, he rose before her, driven by restless energy, and she had heard him stirring in the darkest hour of the night. So she stood there alone, taking in the sight of the waking city. From this vantage, she glimpsed narrow streets lined with tall, flat-roofed buildings, and the bright bursts of color from market awnings. The architecture was so foreign to her northern eyes. No steep roofs to shed snow, no heavy timber to stand against the cold. Everything here was built to catch the breeze and defy the sun. She let her thoughts drift to the day ahead. They would break their fast with Prince Doran and the courtiers of House Martell, and then she would begin to learn more of Sunspear's ways. Oberyn had promised to take her on a tour of the palace, including the gardens and private corridors. Dorne felt like another world, and if she was truly to be a part of it, she had to accustom herself to every detail. When she was dressed in a light gown of pale linen with short sleeves, far different from the heavy brocades of King's Landing, she made her way through the cool corridors. Servants greeted her politely, many with curiosity in their gazes. She realized that, to most of them, she was the northern princess plucked from the lion's den and brought to the land of sun and spear. Some bowed deeply, muttering "Princess Sansa" or "My lady," while others simply stared. She forced herself to hold her head high. She wore a small sun and spear brooch pinned at her shoulder, a gesture acknowledging her new house, though she also wore a silver direwolf charm she kept tucked under her bodice. That small token of Winterfell reminded her of who she was and who she had once been. She found Oberyn in a tall, airy solar overlooking a courtyard of palms. He stood with Ellaria, the two of them engaged in hushed conversation with one of Oberyn's guards. When Sansa appeared, the guard bowed his head and slipped away, leaving Oberyn and Ellaria alone with her. Ellaria offered a soft smile, her bronze cheeks catching the early sunlight, and Oberyn extended a hand for Sansa to join them at a low table set with fresh fruit, warm flatbread, and pitchers of water. The sense of citrus and spiced tea wafted up, making Sansa's stomach clench with hunger. "Good morning," Oberyn said, pressing a brief kiss to her cheek. "You slept well." "As well as I might in this heat," she answered with a tentative smile. "I'll grow used to it, I'm sure." Ellaria gestured for Sansa to sit on a cushion across from her. "Have you tried these oranges yet? They're grown in the groves outside the city, Oberyn's favorite. He always claims they're sweeter than a king's ransom." Sansa accepted a small wedge of the fruit. Juice trickled over her fingers when she bit into it, a bright flavor flooding her tongue. The sweetness was balanced by a hint of tang that made her close her eyes for a moment. "Delicious," she said, and Ellaria's smile widened in approval. They spoke little at first, letting the morning hush cradle them. Soft breezes drifted through the open arches, and dappled light played on the mosaic tiles beneath the table. Sansa considered what this meal would have been like in King's Landing. Guards posted at every door, watchful eyes of the Lannisters, a bleak undercurrent of fear. Here, she felt something akin to possibility in the air, though she knew Oberyn's presence was still a shield. She had not yet navigated the labyrinth of Dornish politics on her own. At length, Oberyn set down his cup, meeting Sansa's gaze. "My brother has expressed interest in speaking with you privately. He wants to ensure you are comfortable, that you understand you have a place here. I think he also wants to hear your impressions of King's Landing firsthand." He smiled, a little wryly. "He rarely left Sunspear for the capital. He relies on accounts from me and our envoys, but your perspective would be new." Sansa felt a slight tension in her chest at the thought of meeting Prince Doran on her own, but she nodded. "I'd be honored to speak with him." She swallowed a sip of water. "Will you be there?" Oberyn glanced at Ellaria, then back to Sansa. "I can be if you wish, but I suspect he wants to speak to you without me looming over his shoulder. You have your own stories to share." Ellaria placed a reassuring hand on Sansa's arm. "He won't be unkind. Doran is cautious, yes, but he is a man of courtesy and deep thought. He's also curious about the North. His mother used to tell him stories of how starkly different that land is, pardon the pun, and how the Martells had never once been conquered by the dragons of old. He wonders how your people endured so many harsh winters." Sansa managed a small laugh, though her mind drifted to Winterfell buried in snow, wolves howling in the distance. "We endure because we must. That's what it means to be of the North." Oberyn's expression turned solemn. "You are of the North, but you're also of Dorne now. You need not shed one identity to uphold the other, but Dorne will demand a part of your heart if you let it." "I understand," she said quietly, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. She thought of how she wore the Martell sigil now, how everything about her station had changed. Yet she still was, at her core, a Stark. She suspected she always would be. By midday, she made her way through Sunspear's corridors under the watchful eye of a steward who had been assigned to guide her. The keep was more of a sprawling palace than the centralized fortresses she knew. Balconies opened onto sun-washed courtyards, corridors twisted around enclosed gardens, and archways revealed glimpses of the sea. Shade was precious. Ornamental palm trees and water fountains were everywhere, offering respite from the heat. She was shown into a modest but elegant hall, where Prince Doran sat beside an open window in his wheeled chair. A small table in front of him bore a scattering of parchments and a bowl of ripe pomegranates. He was dressed in robes of muted orange, the Martell sun and spear stitched on tea, he breast in subtle gold thread. He looked up when she entered, and a measured smile curved on his lips. "Lady Sansa," he said, gesturing for her to join him. "Or should I say, Princess Sansa of House Martell? I hope you are finding Sunspear to your liking." She sank into a graceful curtsy, then took the seat he indicated. "Thank you, my prince. Your hospitality is most generous. The castle is beautiful." Doran studied her, his dark eyes keen with intellect. "I'm pleased to hear it. Oberyn informed me of your journey, that you traveled through the Prince's Pass without incident. He mentioned that you have never ventured this far south before." She shook her head. "No, my lord. In truth, I had rarely even left the north until coming to King's Landing. Then, my life became complicated." A shadow of sympathy passed across Doran's face. "I know something of complicated lives. My health confines me here, but my responsibilities draw me in many directions. I trust my brother is treating you well." Sansa felt a warmth flood her cheeks. She nodded. "He's been kind and patient beyond what I expected. He's done so much for me already." Doran inclined his head in acknowledgement. "My brother is many things, impulsive, fierce, passionate, but his loyalty to family is unwavering. Now you are family, in truth, so I expect he will guard you as fiercely as any Martell. I admit, when he wrote me about the proposed marriage, I was astonished. House Stark bound to House Martell. There is a certain poetry in that, is there not?" Sansa managed a small smile. "I suppose so." Doran lifted a pomegranate from the bowl, turning it in his hands. "I heard a rumor that Lord Tywin tried to use the fate of your sister to force concessions from my brother. Oberyn did not give me the details, but I gather there was some talk of Arya Stark. Is that true?" Sansa's heart clenched. She glanced aside, remembering how Tywin had casually dangled the news. He hinted she might be in the Riverlands, traveling with Sandor Clegane. But we have no proof. Lord Tywin demanded Oberyn swear his support before he would reveal any more. Doran set the fruit down gently. "That sounds like Tywin Lannister. He leverages knowledge the way a Dornishman leverages the sun. Oberyn wouldn't yield, I assume." She shook her head. "No. He promised instead to send out his own searchers, to gather rumors in the towns and among travelers. I don't know if we'll find her, but part of me can't bear the thought of doing nothing." Doran's voice gentled. "Oberyn is thorough when he sets his mind to a task. If your sister is alive, there is hope. Sometimes hope is enough to keep us moving forward." He paused. "If it eases your heart, I can speak with my own network of contacts. Dorne is not as far removed from the rest of the realm as some believe. There are ways to glean information discreetly." Sansa felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, my prince." Doran nodded, studying her face. "I have watched many changes in the realm from this very seat. I recall the day I heard of your father's death. I remember how it shook the north. Now you are here, and the north itself is battered by war and chaos. I wonder, do you hold any hope of reclaiming your home one day?" The question caught her off guard. She swallowed. "My home, Winterfell. Sometimes I dream of it. The last I heard, the Boltons held it, but I don't know the truth of what is happening there. My brother Robb was killed. My mother too. My younger brothers, I'm not sure if any survived. I've clung to a thread of hope. Yet hope alone can't undo the damage done." Doran's gaze was sympathetic, though she sensed his mind was calculating the possibilities. "The realm shifts like sand in the wind, Lady Sansa. Alliances are forged, broken, and reforged. Perhaps if you found enough support, you might rally those loyal to House Stark. The North has a proud memory." She felt a knot in her throat. "I have no claim beyond my name, and my name now is Martell. The North might see that as a betrayal." Doran tilted his head. "I doubt it. You are still Eddard Stark's daughter. Many men would kneel for that name if given the chance to dethrone the Boltons. But I won't urge you into any action. I only say, do not consider your future foreclosed. The world can surprise you." His words lingered in her mind long after she left his presence. She wandered the palace corridors in a contemplative haze, imagining what it would mean to ride north with a Dornish host, to stand before the gates of Winterfell and claim it once more in the name of the Starks. The notion was both thrilling and terrifying. She wasn't a warrior. She had hardly the cunning of Arya or the prowess of her brothers. She was simply Sansa, scarred, learning, trying to find her way. Still, that faint image of the North's wide sky hovered in her thoughts. That evening, Oberyn took her to one of the castle balconies to watch the sun dip below the horizon. The sky bled into a riot of purples and oranges, reflected on the water in shards of brilliance. A gentle breeze ruffled Sansa's auburn hair, and she leaned on the balustrade, letting herself be entranced by the sight. Oberyn stood beside her, arms crossed against his chest. "Dorne is most beautiful at dusk," he said softly. "The heat begins to relent, and you can breathe." She turned her head to look at him, noticing the glow on his face. "It's beautiful," she agreed, "but also strange. Everything here feels so new." He placed a hand over hers. "Does that frighten you?" She thought on it for a moment. "Yes and no. I've spent so much of my life afraid, but being here, it's like I have the freedom to breathe, as you said. Perhaps that's the part that frightens me. I'm not used to it." His grip tightened gently. "I don't want you to live in fear. Not here." She gazed out at the horizon again. "Then teach me how not to." He was silent for a heartbeat, then turned her toward him. "We shall see if we can manage that together." The following days unfolded into a rhythm. Sansa learned to cope with the heat, rising early to take cool baths, covering her head with wide-brimmed hats or sheer veils when venturing into the city. Oberyn showed her the water gardens, a splendid retreat designed by the Martells generations ago. A maze of pools and fountains ringed by orange trees. Children of noble and common birth alike were welcome to play there, splashing in the shallow basins, reminding Sansa of simpler times when she had played with Arya in the courtyards of Winterfell. The gardens exuded a sense of peace that she found both soothing and bittersweet. Ellaria accompanied them often, drawing Sansa into conversations about fashion, local markets, and the intricacies of Dornish inheritance laws, which allowed women a greater say than many other regions. Sansa found herself intrigued by the idea of a land where the birth of a daughter was as celebrated as the birth of a son, where bastards like the Sand Snakes could still hold rank and garner respect if they proved themselves worthy. The Sand Snakes themselves were a whirlwind of presence. Each daughter of Oberyn possessed a unique temperament. Obara, eldest of the recognized daughters, was tall and muscular, her hair shorn close. She preferred to dress in leather and practiced with the spear daily. Nymeria Sand, called Lady NYM, wore silks and earrings, but she was no less dangerous. Her whip was rumored to be as lethal as any sword. Tyene, seemingly sweet-faced, possessed a knowledge of poisons that made grown men wary. There were others too, younger, scattered in different corners of Dorne, each carrying Oberyn's fierce spirit in her own way. Sansa watched them with mingled awe and caution. They circled around her with curiosity, some openly warm, others more reserved. Tyene was the most approachable. She offered to show Sansa how to grind certain herbs for medicinal salves. Obara eyed Sansa with a soldier's assessment, seemingly unsure how to treat a northern lady who had ended up as her father's bride. Nymeria offered polite conversation but often changed the subject to Oberyn's tales of King's Landing, pressing for details about the Lannisters. Sansa gleaned that the Sand Snakes bore as much hatred for the killers of their aunt, Elia Martell, as Oberyn did. One afternoon, while resting in one of the smaller courtyards, Sansa found Ellaria leaning against a stone pillar, eyes half-lidded as she listened to the distant chatter of children. Sansa approached quietly, wearing a modest gown of flowing saffron fabric. Ellaria noticed her and patted the bench beside her, inviting Sansa to sit. "You look thoughtful," Ellaria remarked, tilting her head. "What stirs in your mind?" Sansa folded her hands in her lap. "I was thinking about the North, about how I used to hide in the Godswood to read songs of old heroes. I wonder if my sister is hiding somewhere now, alone. I wonder if anyone is singing. And I wonder if I'll ever see the snows of Winterfell again." She paused, glancing at Ellaria. Do you think me ungrateful? Here I am, in Dorne, with a husband who respects me, and I can't stop remembering the past." Ellaria reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from Sansa's face. "It is natural to think of home. Dorne cannot erase who you are. And your sister, she matters. You love her. That is no crime. We do not ask you to forget." Sansa felt emotion welling in her chest. "I only wish I had some certainty, that I could act. Waiting is so hard." Ellaria's gaze softened with understanding. "Oberyn has many contacts. Doran has more. They're whisperers, they're spies. Someone will find clues. In the meantime, perhaps you can find your place here. Grow stronger, so that when your sister is found, you can be the one to help her." Sansa nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She recalled the old Sansa who had done little but dream of tourneys and songs. That girl, she thought, would never have imagined forging alliances or seeking lost siblings through political cunning. But that girl had died in King's Landing, replaced by someone tempered in the crucible of betrayal and sorrow. Days lengthened into weeks. Prince Doran kept a quiet watch over affairs, meeting regularly with Oberyn to discuss the stance Dorne would take toward the Iron Throne. Ravens arrived bearing news from King's Landing. Murmurings that Tywin Lannister was consolidating power, that Mace Tyrell was scheming to marry his daughter Marjorie to King Tommen, that the crown was still uneasy about the loyalty of Dorne. Through it all, Oberyn paced like a caged cat. Sansa sensed his frustration, as though he itched for a direct confrontation with those who had wronged his family. But Doran's careful counsel often prevailed. One evening, after a tense meeting, Oberyn sought Sansa out in their shared quarters. Tall windows overlooked the moonlit sea, and the faint cry of gulls drifted through the night air. Sansa was seated at a small desk, trying to read a Dornish history tome, but finding her attention wavering. She stood as Oberyn entered, noticing the tightness in his features. He tossed aside his sandals and poured himself a goblet of wine, draining half of it in one swallow. Sansa approached cautiously, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What troubles you?" He set down the cup. "We have word that Tywin Lannister is strengthening the alliance with the Tyrells. As expected, he wants their gold and their harvests. But if the realm tips toward war again, or if the Greyjoys cause more havoc in the west, Tywin may call upon Dorne to send spears. And in the same breath, he still withholds the truth of who murdered my sister's children." His voice grew taut, eyes burning. "He thinks I'll bend eventually, that Doran will counsel me to keep the peace. But how can I make peace with the man who orchestrated Elaya's death?" Sansa's heart twisted. She knew that pain. If you fight him now, you'd be giving him reason to tighten his grip on the throne. Dorne is strong, but the Lannisters still hold the advantage in open war. Prince Doran sees that, doesn't he? Oberyn laughed bitterly. Yes, Doran sees everything from his chair. He's not wrong that caution may serve us better than rash action. Yet I'm tired of caution. His gaze fell on her. I never asked for the burden of your sister's safety, but I took it on willingly. Now, in addition, I must stomach Lannister posturing. She stepped closer, resting her other hand on his arm. I'm sorry for what Tywin is doing. I know how anger can fester, but you're not alone. You have me. She hesitated, forcing herself to speak her next words carefully. If there's any way my presence can help, some negotiation or a letter, tell me. I'd do it. His eyes softened. You would, wouldn't you? But I don't want you entangled in his webs more than you already are. Let me handle Tywin. She could sense the storm raging within him. Gently, she lifted her hand to cup his cheek, a gesture of comfort that was slowly becoming more natural. He let out a long breath, leaning into her touch. In that moment, their shared experiences, her father's death, his sister's murder, the cruelty they both had endured under Lannister arrogance, drew them together in a quiet understanding. He pulled her into an embrace, and she let her forehead rest against his chest. The rise and fall of his breath was steady, and the feel of it anchored her in the swirling uncertainty of their world. Time wore on, and Sansa began to see how Dorne's court was a tapestry of secrets and loyalties, as complex as King's Landing but more openly passionate. Feasts were lively, with dancing and music echoing across torchlit courtyards. Wine flowed freely, and heated debates often erupted between nobles. Yet beneath the revelry lay an undercurrent of vigilance. Oberyn's thirst for revenge, Doran's measured plotting, the Sand Snake's readiness to defend their father's name, and Illyria's watchful gaze that missed nothing. Sansa recognized a pattern. The Martells might smile, might indulge in pleasures, but none forgot their old wounds. She attended a small feast in the Outer Bailey one late afternoon, meant to honor a minor lord from the Tor who had come to pledge renewed allegiance. Musicians played lutes and drums, while jugglers and fire-eaters performed for the crowd. As the sky darkened, braziers were lit, sending sparks dancing upward. Sansa sat beside Oberyn and Illyria, listening to the drumbeats that seemed to mirror her own heartbeat. The smell of roasted goat and cinnamon lingered in the air. Partway through the entertainment, Oberyn Sand approached, wearing a light tunic and breeches in the Dornish style. She tossed her spear from hand to hand with casual ease, then sank into a seat near Sansa. With little preamble, Oberyn said, "You're from the north. You must have learned how to ride properly. Ever raced across the snows on horseback?" Sansa found herself a bit startled by the directness. "I can ride, but I've never been much for racing. The roads in the north can be treacherous, especially when covered in ice." Oberyn nodded. "We ride differently here. Perhaps tomorrow you'll come with me to the training yard. Let me see if you can stay in the saddle when I push the pace." Sansa glanced at Oberyn, who watched with a small, amused smile. She sensed no mockery in Oberyn's offer, only a challenge. "I'll try," she said, bracing herself for what that might entail. The next morning, true to her word, Oberyn found Sansa and whisked her away to a sandy training field behind the castle stables. A row of lean Dornish horses pawed the ground under the bright sun. Oberyn selected one for Sansa, a sleek mare of golden-brown coat with intelligent eyes, while Oberyn mounted a fiery black stallion. Sansa adjusted her stirrups carefully, feeling tension coil in her stomach. She had ridden in the north, yes, but never in such open desert conditions, and she had never been forced to match pace with someone like Oberyn Sand. They began at a walk, circling the arena, Sansa's skirts hiked up enough to free her legs. A few Martell guards looked on with idle curiosity, along with a handful of local onlookers. Oberyn grinned, spurred her stallion forward, and took off at a canter. Sansa urged her mare to follow, rising in the saddle with practiced motion. The heat seemed to shimmer around them, the arena's sand puffing under the horses' hooves. Oberyn pushed faster, and Sansa had to grip the reins tight, heart pounding. In a burst of dust, they galloped, hair whipping behind them. Sansa's adrenaline surged, fear battling exhilaration. She leaned low, trusting her mount. Oberyn's laughter rang out, fierce and unrestrained. When they slowed at last, pulling back on the reins, Sansa found herself out of breath, her cheeks flaming. Oberyn halted her stallion and turned, cocking an eyebrow in approval. "You're not bad," Oberyn allowed, wiping sweat from her brow. Most highborn ladies would be squealing or clinging to the saddle in terror. "You held on." Sansa caught her breath. "I've learned a lot about holding on." Oberyn's grin softened fractionally. "So I see." She patted the neck of her stallion. "If you're to be Dornish, you should know how to ride like one. I'll teach you more, if you're willing." Sansa nodded. She felt a stirring of resolve. Perhaps it was time she learned to do more than hide behind courtesy and courtesy alone. She had seen how harsh the world could be. Surviving meant gaining new skills, forging alliances. "I'd like that," she said. After the ride, they returned the horses to the stable. As Sansa dismounted, she noticed Oberyn leaning against the stable door, arms folded, a lazy smile on his face. "My daughter has tested you," he remarked. "You seem to have passed." Oberyn scoffed good-naturedly. "She's got grit." When Oberyn left, Oberyn approached Sansa, placing a hand on her shoulder. She was still flushed from the exertion and the heat. "You're pushing yourself," he observed. "I admire that, but be careful not to overdo it. The Dornish sun can be cruel to those unaccustomed." She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I'll be all right. I just don't want to be that frightened girl anymore." He studied her face with a hint of gentleness. "You're not." Then, taking her hand, he led her to a shaded area near a trough of cool water. There, he poured water into a cup for her, and she drank gratefully, savoring the relief in her throat. As she did, she thought once more of how odd it was that this man, the Red Viper, had come to be her partner in this strange life. She remembered how she had once imagined being rescued by a golden-haired prince. Reality was sharper, hotter, far more layered than her girlish fantasies. Yet in many ways she realized it was also more genuine. As weeks rolled into months, Sansa's fear of being an outsider began to lessen. She discovered that many among the Dornish court welcomed her presence. Some admired the novelty, a daughter of the North, bride to their beloved Oberyn. Others, more pragmatic, saw her as a crucial link in forging new alliances or gleaning knowledge of the North's resources. She found that courtiers sought her out, asking questions about winter wheat yields, about the rumored vastness of the North, about the loyalty of certain bannermen. She answered with what she knew, careful not to betray the memory of her fallen family. She also began to learn the Rhoynish prayers that some Dornish followed, especially those that invoked Mother Rhoyne for blessings of fertility and long life. It amazed her that Westeros held so many different traditions, even though the faith of the Seven remained the dominant religion in most places. In the north, they had the old gods, silent watchers in weirwood trees. Here in Dorne, the old ways of the Rhoyner mingled with the Seven, and no one batted an eye at the mixture. It was a refreshing change from the rigid piety she had observed in King's Landing. During that time, a raven arrived from Varys, the spymaster in King's Landing, bearing cryptic words about movements in the Riverlands. Sansa wasn't privy to the entire message, but Oberyn told her that some group of outlaws had been reported traveling with a young girl who might match Arya's description. It was rumor layered with rumor, but it was more than they'd had before. The thought that Arya could still be alive lifted Sansa's spirits and tormented her in equal measure. One night, as she drifted in uneasy half-sleep, she woke to find Oberyn staring at the ceiling, the moonlight casting silver shadows on his face. The air was still and warm, and she could hear the faint rush of waves against the city's walls. "Can't sleep?" she murmured. He turned his head, exhaling softly. "No, my mind wanders." She shifted closer on the bed, pressing her palm against his chest. "Thinking about your sister?" He nodded. "Elia, Rhaenys, Aegon." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Their ghosts never leave me." After a pause, he turned his gaze to her. "You know something of that, with your father and your mother, your brother." Sansa rested her head against his shoulder, letting the stillness cradle them. The closeness felt more natural to her now, though it had been a slow journey from fear to trust. "If they are ghosts, at least we keep them alive by remembering," she whispered. "They deserve that." He slid an arm around her, and they lay in the hush of the night. Her thoughts drifted to Winterfell, to Ned Stark's quiet smile, to Lady Catelyn's protective embrace. She wondered if there was any chance her mother's body had been returned to the north, if her brother's men had been given proper burials. Likely not, war seldom granted such kindness. She closed her eyes, letting Oberyn's heartbeat soothe her. Somewhere in the world, Arya was alive, she told herself. She had to be. The next morning, she rose early to pray in her own way, a mixture of the old god's quiet reflection and the Seven's formal words that she had learned as a child. She went to a secluded corner of the water gardens, where the shade of orange trees offered a cool sanctuary. Kneeling by a shallow, reflecting pool, she dipped her fingers in, letting the water ripple outward in concentric circles. She prayed not just for Arya but for some measure of guidance for herself. If she truly was forging a new life in Dorne, she needed strength to face whatever might come. She turned to find Ilaria standing a short distance away, arms folded loosely, her expression warm. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Ilaria said softly. Sansa stood, brushing off her skirts. You weren't disturbing. I was just thinking. Ilaria approached, her light robes trailing behind her, the design of serpents embroidered along the hem. You and Oberyn are growing closer. I see it in the way he looks at you. There was no accusation in her tone, only quiet observation. I'm glad for him. And for you. Sansa hesitated, recalling how Ilaria was the paramour who had shared Oberyn's life long before Sansa came into the picture. Does it bother you? She asked, voice tentative. Ilaria gave a gentle laugh. We Dornish are not so easily bothered by the affections of the heart. I've never wished to chain him or to be chained myself. I see that he cares for you, and that you are finding a place here. That is a good thing. The world is cruel enough without us making it harder. A rush of relief washed over Sansa. Thank you. Ilaria tilted her head. But do not mistake our open ways for passivity. If someone tries to harm this family, if someone from King's Landing were to arrive with ill intent, I would strike at them like a viper. I protect what I love. Sansa nodded, understanding perfectly. In King's Landing, she had seen passivity used as a weapon, but Ilaria's directness felt refreshing. I'm learning that lesson too, Sansa said. It might take time, but I want to be able to defend what I have now. Ilaria smiled. You will. In the afternoons, Sansa continued her riding lessons with Obara, growing more comfortable on the swift Dornish horses. At night, she dined with Oberyn and Ilaria, or with the wider court in Prince Doran's halls. She learned to dance Dornish reels, guided by Nymeria Sand's teasing instruction. She explored the city of Sunspear under guard, sampling spiced dishes at the open-air markets, listening to the rhythmic calls of traders hawking their goods. The people were vibrant, their music lively. The sting of heartbreak still lurked in Sansa's soul, but these experiences layered over it like warm paint on a cold canvas. One day, as she walked through the palace corridors, she spotted a young girl stepping hesitantly around a corner, her face half hidden in shadow. The girl wore a simple yellow dress, and her dark hair was braided in 2 plaits. At the sight of Sansa, she froze, her eyes widening like those of a startled fawn. Sansa offered a gentle smile. Hello, Sansa said. Are you lost? The girl stepped forward cautiously, revealing that she was perhaps 10 years of age. I was trying to find the library, she said in a soft voice. My father said it was near the fountain with the mosaic fish, but I can't see the fish anywhere. Sansa recalled that Doran had a smaller library near the southern wing, close to a fish mosaic. I think I know where it is. Would you like me to show you? The girl nodded eagerly, her features relaxing. Yes, please. They walked together down a hallway with open arches that let in a mild ocean breeze. Sansa realized the girl had the look of a Martell about her, perhaps a cousin or a half-sibling. What's your name? Sansa asked. Elia Sand. The girl answered quietly, glancing up. My mother is... Well, I live near the water gardens with her, but I come to visit sometimes. My father said I could read the books about the Rhoynar warriors. Sansa's heart clenched a little at the name Elia, so resonant in Oberyn's life. I'm sure the library has some interesting histories. I've been reading them too, though I grew up on stories of the North. Elia seemed intrigued. Is it very cold? Did you see direwolves? Sansa smiled wistfully. When I was little, my father once brought home a pup, but direwolves are rare these days. As for the cold, yes, sometimes it was so cold your fingers felt numb even under your gloves. Elia looked amazed. I'd like to see snow someday. I hope you do, Sansa said, leading her around another corner. This is the mosaic fountain. See the fish tiles? The library is just through that door on the left. Elia beamed. Thank you, princess. She ran off, footsteps echoing, leaving Sansa standing by the fountain, the lingering sound of children's laughter fading. In that moment, she felt both a pang of longing for the innocence she once had, and a small bloom of contentment, knowing she was part of a place where children could wander halls in relative safety. She whispered a silent prayer to the old gods, or perhaps to the new, that Dorne might remain untouched by the worst cruelties that had consumed the North and King's Landing. But the world beyond Dorne continued to churn. Ravens brought reports of growing tensions in the west, rumors that Balon Greyjoy had died, leaving the Iron Islands in potential upheaval. The Vale was said to be quiet under the rule of young Lord Robert Arryn, but whispers of Littlefinger's machinations abounded. In the Riverlands, outlaws roamed free, and the Freys tightened their grip on the twins. In the north, Roose Bolton maintained a grim hold, and the Lannisters maintained a presence in the capital. Yet no direct conflict erupted, only an uneasy peace, as if the realm were holding its breath. Late one night, Oberyn returned from a discussion with Doran, looking more tense than usual. Sansa rose from her seat by a flickering lamp. "What's happened?" she asked. He shut the door and leaned against it, raking a hand through his dark hair. "There's a rumor that Myrcella Baratheon, or Myrcella Lannister, as some would call her, may be sent to Dorne to seal a betrothal. It's an old arrangement that Tyrion once proposed in the name of peace, matching her to my nephew Trystane. She's King Tommen's sister. If she arrives, it changes everything." Sansa's heart twisted. She remembered Myrcella, a sweet girl who had shown Sansa kindness at times, in contrast to Joffrey's cruelty. Would Prince Doran agree? Oberyn shrugged. He might. Taking Myrcella as a ward or a betrothed princess here could give Dorne leverage. But it also means Tywin might push to have her placed under Martell protection for his own reasons, perhaps to safeguard the girl. Or to use her. Hard to say. Tywin never does anything without a deeper plan. Sansa pressed her lips together. "Do you think she's in danger from the Tyrells or someone else at court?" "Possibly. Or Tywin might fear the rumors that Stannis Baratheon is stirring again. Myrcella is valuable politically." He paused, studying Sansa's reaction. "If she comes, will it trouble you?" She drew a breath, recalling the younger girl's gentle smiles. "It won't trouble me personally. Myrcella was always kind to me, but it reminds me how the Lannisters continue to weave themselves through every corner of the realm." Oberyn reached for her hand. "We will see how Prince Doran decides. But if Myrcella comes, it may be an opportunity. Tywin wants Dorne's loyalty. We might gain more than he expects. Truth about your sister, perhaps." She nodded, though the mention of Arya sparked renewed anxiety in her chest. "I'd do anything to find Arya," she whispered. "Even tolerate Myrcella's presence if it means Tywin might relent." Oberyn's jaw flexed. "We'll see who relents first." In the weeks that followed, no final word arrived regarding Myrcella. Instead, the tension in the air thickened, as if the entire realm was on edge. Through it all, Sansa continued to carve out her own place. She studied swordplay from a distance, watching Obara's drills. She took lessons in the local dialect from a palace scholar, learning the Rhoynish words that peppered everyday Dornish speech. She even dared to voice her opinions during minor court disputes, once assisting a local farmer who claimed a lesser noble's men had trampled his fields. She mediated gently, leaning on what she knew of justice from her father's teachings, and was surprised when Prince Doran praised her tact. Sansa realized she was no longer the wide-eyed girl who had arrived in King's Landing believing in glamorous courts and honorable knights. She was forging a new identity, part Stark, part Martell, part survivor. And in Oberyn, she found both a partner in intimacy and a mentor in navigating power. It was on a blistering afternoon when a new raven arrived bearing urgent tidings. A band of Sellswords operating near the Trident had been captured, and among them was rumored to be a wolf girl. Sansa's pulse skyrocketed when Oberyn relayed the message. She paced their chamber, the stone walls seeming to close in on her. "Could it be Arya?" she asked, voice trembling with hope and fear. "It could," Oberyn said, though his expression was guarded. "Or it could be a false rumor. Doran will try to get more details." She clenched her hands. "I can't just wait here. I want to go myself." He caught her wrists gently. Charging into the Riverlands would be madness. The Freys hold the twins. The Lannisters have eyes everywhere, and the roads are filled with broken men. You'd be risking capture or worse. She knew he was right, but the longing to rescue her sister gnawed at her. But if she's truly been captured, what then? Will they kill her? Sell her to the highest bidder? A flicker of anger crossed his features. Let me speak to Doran. We'll send a trusted agent. Someone who can confirm the rumor. She forced herself to nod, tears brimming. Please do it quickly. He pulled her close, resting his chin on her hair. She felt the weight of his concern. The tension coiled in his body. Over the next few days, messages flew between Sunspear and the broader networks of Dornish informants. She heard snatches of conversation about bribes and disguised riders heading north. Meanwhile, the palace's routine continued. Audiences, dinners, training. Sansa moved through it all in a haze, counting the hours until any word returned. When at last a courier arrived from the Stormlands region, Oberyn and Doran withdrew into a private meeting. Sansa waited outside the door of Doran's solar, nerves shredding her composure. Illyria stayed with her, offering a comforting hand, but Sansa could barely keep still. She felt as though every minute was a lifetime. Finally, Oberyn emerged, expression solemn. Sansa's heart dropped. What did they say? She demanded, voice raw. He exhaled slowly. It was a false lead, another girl, apparently from a lesser branch of the Stark's household men. She carried a wolf's head brooch, perhaps stolen. She's not Arya. Sansa closed her eyes, tears slipping free. She felt Illyria's arm encircle her shoulders. The surge of emotion left her trembling, both relief that Arya might still be free somewhere, and despair that she still had no certainty of her sister's fate. Gods, she whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. Oberyn's voice was soft. I'm sorry. She nodded, swallowing her tears. She should have known, she told herself bitterly. Tywin's manipulations, the realm's rumor-mongering, the false sparks of hope that so often haunted her. She felt a hollow ache settle into her bones. But she steadied herself, meeting Oberyn's gaze. We keep looking. He nodded, stepping forward to place a hand on her cheek. We do. She turned away, brushing tears from her eyes. She felt Illyria's supportive presence, but the emptiness inside her seemed vast. If Arya was still out there, she was alone. And as Sansa stood in the sun-drenched corridors of Sunspear, she realized that this waiting, this uncertainty, might be her burden for a long time to come. Life continued in a series of small triumphs and quiet sadnesses. She made friends among the palace staff, showing them courtesy that was not always extended by the highborn. A few of the sand snakes taught her basic self-defense with a small dagger, just enough to fend off an unskilled attacker. Obara was the strictest teacher, drilling stance and strike until Sansa's arms ached. Tyene teased her gently, reminding her that poisons were often more potent than knives. Through it all, Sansa found a cautious confidence blooming inside her. She was no longer the frightened maiden who relied solely on prayers and illusions. Her relationship with Oberyn deepened, turning into an easy companionship layered with physical closeness and mutual respect. Sometimes it was playful, like when they sparred verbally over politics or teased each other during a midday meal. Sometimes it was heated, his kisses still carrying the taste of wine and vengeance, the memory of old hurts that demanded closeness to salve them. And sometimes it was tender, a quiet comfort in the hush of night, when nightmares of lost family haunted them both. In all these ways, Sansa felt herself transforming. She was still a Stark, still carried the scars of King's Landing, but she was also learning to be a Martell. She began to see how a single name could hold multiple truths, and in the swirl of possibilities, she discovered a determination she had never known she possessed. It was nearing the end of her second month in Sunspear when a grand caravan arrived, brightly festooned with the sigil of House Ironwood, the second most powerful house in Dorne. They came bearing lavish gifts for Prince Doran and a retinue of knights and ladies. Sansa watched from a courtyard balcony as the arrivals dismounted, exchanging formal greetings. Among them, she recognized a tall figure with red gold hair, wearing the crest of House Rosby. The man was not Dornish at all. Whispers spread among the courtiers. A royal envoy from King's Landing might be traveling under the Ironwood's protection. Anxiety rippled through the palace. By sunset, Doran convened a reception in the main hall. Sansa dressed carefully, wearing a gown of burnt orange that matched the Martell colors. Her hair braided into a crown-like coil, pinned with small gold suns. She walked in at Oberyn's side, noticing how the chatter quieted upon their entrance. Doran sat at the dais in his wheeled chair, nodding to each arrival with grave courtesy. When the time came, a herald stepped forward to announce the visitors. One was Lord Anders Ironwood, a stern-faced man with a salt and pepper beard, who bowed deeply to Prince Doran. Another was the red-gold-haired man, introduced as Ser Lyle Craighall, a knight sworn to the Lannisters. Ser Lyle was followed by a slender woman in deep blue silks, introduced simply as Lady Rosby's cousin, a minor noble not well known. Yet as the woman stepped forward, Sansa caught a flicker of something in the woman's eyes, something calculating, too measured. She felt a prickle of unease. What reason did a cousin of House Rosby have to come to Sunspear, of all places? Prince Doran welcomed them with the politeness due to guests. Lord Ironwood spoke of fostering better relations among the houses of Dorne. Ser Lyle Craighall extended King Tommen's greetings and read a letter from the young king, affirming a hope for peace. The usual formalities followed, courtiers applauding politely. Sansa watched Oberyn's face. He smiled, but it was the smile of a viper biding its time. After the greetings, Doran invited the guests to dine. Servants began to bring out platters of roasted peppers stuffed with rice and saffron, spiced lamb, fresh fruit, and flagons of rich Dornish wine. Sansa noted that Lady Rosby's cousin seemed to take in the surroundings with an inquisitive eye, occasionally whispering to Ser Lyle. She decided she would keep her distance until she could learn more. Something about the woman unsettled her. Perhaps a hint of that subtle, lurking presence she had learned to associate with Lannister intrigues. The evening wore on with music and measured courtesies. Oberyn indulged in lively banter, exchanging barbed pleasantries with Ser Lyle. Sansa joined in polite conversation with Lord Ironwood's wife, who asked about the North's traditions. Beneath the surface, tension crackled like a drawn bowstring. The Lannisters, through these envoys, were reaching out to Dorne again, and no one could quite forget the history that lay between them. When the feast ended, Doran adjourned to speak privately with Lord Ironwood. Oberyn and Sansa made their way to a more secluded colonnade, stepping into the mild night air. Braziers lined the walkway, casting flickering light across their path. The murmur of distant voices drifted from within the palace halls. Sansa breathed deeply, trying to ease the knot in her stomach. "The Lannisters never quit," Oberyn muttered, leaning against a carved pillar. "They'll try one angle, then another, until they get what they want." Sansa nodded, thinking of Ser Lyle's unwavering courtesy. "Do you think they're here for Myrcella? Or to gauge our readiness for war?" he answered. "Perhaps to flatter Doran into a false sense of security. Tywin is not above sending feelers." Sansa pressed her lips together. "We should be careful about that woman, Lady Rosby's cousin. I don't trust her." He arched an eyebrow. "What did you notice?" "I can't say precisely. Something in her manner. She was watching everything, listening more than she spoke. It reminded me of how Varys would hover at court, or how Littlefinger stood in corners, quietly calculating." Oberyn inclined his head. "You have a good eye. Keep watching. We'll do the same." They walked back into the palace, winding through corridors lit by soft torchlight. Oberyn squeezed her hand in silent thanks for her vigilance. It struck Sansa how far she'd come. She was no longer the naive girl who fell for pretty words and illusions. She had learned to read the undercurrents, to sense danger lurking behind polite smiles. In Dorne, that skill would serve her well. When they reached their chambers, Illyria was waiting, lounging on a divan draped in crimson silk, her dark eyes alert. She sat up as they entered. "The evening's performance was quite something," she remarked. "Ironwood playing the loyal subject, Craighall oozing Lannister courtesy. And that woman. Did you see how she watched every detail?" Sansa nodded. "I did. Who is she, truly?" Illyria shrugged. "I asked around. She claims to be Lady Sinel, newlywed to a cousin of Rosby, but there's little else known. She traveled with Lord Ironwood from the Reach of all places. Strange route for someone from the Crownlands. Oberyn's expression hardened. She's a spy or an agent. Tywin might have placed her there. Or Cersei. We'll keep her under watch. They spoke late into the night, discussing the precarious balance of power, how best to counter the Lannister envoy's attempts at manipulation. Sansa contributed her insights on how the Lannisters had maneuvered at court, how they dangled rewards or punishments to secure alliances. Oberyn listened, thoughtful, while Ellaria teased out potential strategies. In that moment, Sansa realized she was part of something bigger, an intimate war council, forging plans under the flicker of lanterns. And she felt a surge of cautious pride that her experiences, even the painful ones, could help them stand against the Lannisters. The next day saw a flurry of polite visits. Lord Ironwood and his retinue were shown around the palace. Ser Lyle and Lady Sinel paid their respects to Oberyn, offering thinly veiled praise for the gracious hospitality of House Martell. Prince Doran maintained a posture of goodwill, ensuring they would not be able to claim offense. Sansa, meanwhile, played her part as the courteous princess. She joined the women's circle, sipping cooled wine in a shaded pavilion while courtiers exchanged gossip and small talk. Lady Sinel was there, smiling pleasantly, her eyes darting around. Sansa made sure to keep a polite distance, observing the subtle shift in Sinel's posture whenever the conversation drifted toward House Martell's internal affairs. Ellaria, seated nearby, steered the discussion deftly. Whenever Lady Sinel probed for details, asking how often Oberyn traveled, or whether the Sand Snake stayed in Sunspear year-round, Ellaria would shift the topic to lighter matters, deflecting each question with a practiced laugh or a witty remark. Sansa realized Ellaria was an expert at this dance, the gentle redirection of a predator's attention. She followed suit, offering anecdotes of Dorne's beauty or praising the water gardens, never revealing anything that could be construed as a strategic secret. At one point, Lady Sinel turned to Sansa with a keen smile. "Princess, I hear you hail from the distant north. How do you find our Dornish climate?" Sansa smiled politely. "It's quite warm, but not unpleasant. I've grown fond of the fruit, especially the citrus." "And the people?" Sinel asked, swirling her wine cup. "Surely they're different from the Northerners. You must have found the transition interesting." Sansa inclined her head. "Different, yes, but they have shown me every kindness. Dorne is as generous as it is warm." She kept her tone light, revealing nothing personal. She could almost feel Ellaria's approval. Later that afternoon, as the guests retired to their chambers or explored the palace, Sansa stole a moment alone in a secluded corridor. She leaned against a wall, letting the tension slip from her shoulders. She had not realized how much energy it took to maintain composure under Lady Sinel's gaze. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in a steadying breath. Her reverie was broken by the sound of footsteps. Opening her eyes, she saw Lady Sinel herself stepping around the corner. The woman paused, feigning surprise. "Princess Sansa," she said smoothly. "Forgive me. I didn't realize anyone was here." Sansa forced a slight smile. "I was just catching my breath. The palace can be quite busy." Sinel moved closer, her expression pleasant. "I quite agree. It's a maze, isn't it?" She gestured around them. "Hard to find one's way unless you have a guide." Sansa said nothing, keeping her face neutral. Sinel stepped nearer, lowering her voice. "I am told you once resided at the Red Keep, with the Lannisters." Sansa's stomach twisted. "That's true." Sinel's eyes glinted. "You must have seen so much, heard so much. Men say the realm's fate was decided in those halls, while your father lost his head. How tragic." Anger flared in Sansa's chest, but she kept her composure. "It was." Sinel nodded, her tone almost sympathetic. "And yet you found your way to Dorne, married to Prince Oberyn. How curious life is." Sansa narrowed her eyes, carefully controlling her voice. "Curious indeed." For a moment, Lady Sinel seemed to weigh something, as though deciding whether to press further. Then she offered a tight smile. "I hope you find peace here. Farewell, princess." She swept past, footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Sansa let out a shaky breath, her heart hammering. The woman's words felt like an unspoken threat. She remembered that people in King's Landing had often cast such pointed barbs, testing for weakness. Perhaps Sanel wanted to provoke her into revealing something. Sansa calmed herself, recalling how she had survived Joffrey's torments by mastering her polite mask. She would not break now. When she recounted the encounter to Oberyn later, he listened intently, his mouth tightening into a frown. "We should remain vigilant," he said. "I suspect she's more dangerous than Carlyle. She might be in direct contact with Tywin or Cersei." Sansa nodded. "I won't let her bait me." He brushed a thumb over her knuckles. "Good." Days became a tense dance of hospitality. The Ironwood delegation planned a feast of their own to honor Prince Doran. Carlyle continued to spout pleasantries, while Lady Sanel hovered at the edges of every gathering. Sansa began to suspect the woman might be searching for a secret corridor or eavesdropping on private conversations. Illyria had the servants keep watch, reporting that Sanel asked many questions about the layout of the palace. Amid these undercurrents, Sansa strove to maintain her composure. She found strength in Oberyn's unwavering confidence, in Illyria's knowing smiles, and in the fierce loyalty of the Sand Snakes. Dorne was a place of scorching sun, vibrant life, and silent, lethal readiness. She was growing to embody that spirit herself, soft on the surface, but tempered within. On the final night of the visitor's stay, the Ironwoods hosted an elaborate dinner in a courtyard lit by lanterns shaped like fiery suns. Musicians played a sultry melody, and dancers in flowing scarves drifted among the tables. A warm wind carried the scent of night-blooming flowers. The guests ate and drank beneath the stars, exchanging last attempts at politics. Prince Doran looked on, courteous but inscrutable. Oberyn made a toast to the Ironwoods and to continued friendship. Sansa sat at his side, matching smiles with Lady Sanel, who was seated across from her. Over the course of the meal, Sansa noticed the tension slowly unraveling. Perhaps Doran had assured Ironwood that Dorne would remain at peace for now. Perhaps the Ironwoods believed they had gleaned enough from their visit. Finally, as the dinner drew to a close, the guests began drifting away to pack for their departure on the morrow. Sansa stepped outside the courtyard, seeking a breath of air. The moon hung heavy and bright in the sky. She could hear the distant crash of waves against the rocky coastline. She was about to return to the palace when she heard a soft rustle in the darkness behind a colonnade. Her pulse quickened. Quietly, she moved toward the sound, half expecting to find a servant or a stray cat. But then she recognized the silhouette. Lady Sanel, clad in dark robes, slipping through an archway. A prickle of alarm coursed through Sansa. She glanced around for a guard, seeing none immediately. Perhaps she should turn back, find Oberyn. But an instinct older than her caution stirred. She needed to see what Sanel was doing, to confirm her suspicions. She followed at a distance, treading softly on the stone floor. Sanel moved down a side passage that led toward one of the lesser-used wings of the palace. Lamps were dim here, and shadows danced on the walls. Sansa kept to the darkest edges, her heart pounding. She wondered if it was foolish to follow alone, but she was determined to uncover whatever plot might be unfolding. If Sanel was meeting a co-conspirator or rummaging for secrets, Sansa wanted to know. They traversed several turns, each corridor growing quieter. At last, Sanel slipped through a half-open door into what appeared to be a small storage chamber. Sansa crept close, pressing her ear to the door, hearing faint rustling and the clink of metal. She couldn't quite see inside. Carefully, she inched the door open just a fraction, peering through the gap. Sanel had a small lantern in hand, illuminating shelves stacked with rolled tapestries, spare cushions, and crates. On a table, Sansa spotted a few pieces of parchment and what looked like a hidden compartment in the wall, perhaps a secret cache used by the palace staff. Sanel was rifling through the compartment, pulling out parchments and scanning them quickly, setting them aside. Sansa's blood ran cold. The woman was searching for documents, maybe something related to Dorne's troop placements or letters from King's Landing. A wave of anger rippled through Sansa at the violation. She thought of stepping forward, confronting Sansa, but fear held her back. She had no weapon and she was alone. Instead, she continued to watch, her breath shallow. Suddenly, a voice came from behind Sansa. Quiet, low, dangerous. "Move away from the door, princess." Sansa froze, spinning around to see Ser Lal Crakehall standing a few paces behind her, a dagger gleaming in his hand. Her heart lurched. She opened her mouth to cry out, but he lunged forward, pressing the blade to her side, not breaking the skin but forcing her to stifle a scream. "Don't." His voice was a harsh whisper. "We don't want to hurt you, but we will if we must." Her mind raced. She cursed herself for coming alone. If he called out, Sansa would notice. Indeed, the woman had likely brought Ser Lyle as a lookout. Fear clawed at Sansa, but so did a surge of defiance. She tried to keep her voice steady. "You're stealing from House Martell." Ser Lyle's jaw tightened. "We're taking what's needed. Now come with me, quietly." Before Sansa could respond, a sharp cry rang out inside the storage chamber, followed by a clash of steel. Sansa gasped, twisting to peer through the door crack. She saw a flash of movement. Someone had stumbled in from another entrance, catching Sansa in the act. A frantic scuffle ensued. Sansa recognized Oberyn's silhouette as the one who had intervened, spear in hand. Oberyn roared a challenge, jabbing at Sansa, who scrambled back with a knife. Ser Lyle swore. Distracted, he turned to rush in and aid Sansa, his dagger lifting from Sansa's side. Sansa seized the moment. She stomped on his foot hard and twisted away. Though terror thundered in her veins, she forced her limbs to move. She bolted back down the corridor, her slippers slipping on the stone. Behind her, she heard Ser Lyle curse, footsteps pounding in pursuit. She sprinted around a corner, her dress tangling around her legs. She had no idea where the palace guards might be at this hour. Her lungs burned as she forced herself to keep going, fear fueling her flight. The corridor branched left, then right, and she took turns almost at random, heart hammering. She could hear Ser Lyle behind her, shouting for her to halt. At last, she turned a corner to find herself at a dead end, an archway leading to a locked gate that opened onto a small side yard. Panic flared. She tugged uselessly on the gate, locked tight. Ser Lyle's footsteps closed in, echoing ominously. The only way out was back the way she came, into his path. Her hand fumbled for something, anything. She found a loose chunk of stone near the wall. Clutching it, she pressed herself against the wall, adrenaline roaring in her ears. She had no illusions about her ability to fight a man with a dagger, but she would not go meekly. Ser Lyle rounded the corner. He spotted her, breath ragged, eyes narrowed. "Don't be a fool, girl. Hand over the stone. Come quietly." She tried to summon every ounce of courage she'd gained since leaving King's Landing. "Stay back," she said, voice trembling but resolute. He snarled, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She saw him tense, preparing to rush her. Time seemed to slow, the air thick with dread. Then came a flurry of motion from behind him, another figure racing into the corridor. It was Oberyn, hair disheveled, eyes blazing, a dagger clutched in his fist. In a single, fluid move, he seized Ser Lyle's shoulder, yanking him backward. Lyle staggered, trying to bring his own blade around, but Oberyn was faster. With lethal precision, he slashed across Lyle's weapon arm, forcing him to drop the dagger. Ser Lyle howled, turning in desperation. Oberyn kicked him square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The dagger clattered out of reach. Oberyn pressed his foot on Lyle's chest, pinning him, rage twisting his features. Sansa sagged in relief against the wall, the stone dropping from her fingers, her entire body shaking. Oberyn's breathing was harsh, fury radiating from him. "You dare draw steel on my wife?" He hissed at Lyle, voice dripping venom. "You worthless cur." Lal struggled, blood trickling from his arm. We had no choice, orders. Lady Sanel. Oberyn pressed harder with his foot, cutting off the man's words. Sansa heard more footsteps. Obara appeared, spear tip glinting, breath heaving. Her tunic was torn, and a smear of blood streaked her cheek. She nodded to Oberyn. The woman got away. She was quick. I managed to wound her, but she fled into the palace yard. Oberyn cursed under his breath, glaring down at Ser Lyle. We'll track her, but first this one. He jerked his head at Obara. Bind him. Obara obliged, pulling cords from her belt to tie Lyle's hands and feet. Sansa watched, her heart still pounding. Her eyes locked with Oberyn's as he strode to her side, concern seizing him the moment he saw the terror in her face. Are you hurt? He asked, hands hovering near her shoulders. She shook her head, tears threatening. No, I'm all right. He put a dagger to me, but I managed to get away. Oberyn brushed her hair back gently, anguish and anger mingling in his expression. I'm sorry. I got here as soon as I realized something was off. He looked at Obara. We need to alert Doran, ensure no other intruders are roaming the palace, and find that woman. Obara nodded grimly, dragging Ser Lyle behind her like a trussed boar. The man glared but said nothing, seeming to weigh his chances of survival. Sansa noticed his trembling, the realization that he'd just attacked the wife of a Martell in their own stronghold. There would be no mercy for him here. Oberyn guided Sansa back through the corridors, his arm firmly around her waist. She leaned against him, her legs still shaky from the adrenaline. Guards rushed to meet them as the alarm spread. The entire palace was roused, torches and lanterns lighting every hallway. Sansa overheard hurried conversations. Sanel had managed to slip into the stables, wounding a guard who tried to stop her, and she had taken a horse. By the time the gates were fully secured, she was gone into the Dornish night, leaving only the wounded Ser Lyle behind. In Doran's solar, the atmosphere was grim and furious. Doran's jaw was set in a hard line as he surveyed the prisoner. Ser Lyle, now bound to a chair, glared at the Martells gathered around. Oberyn stood beside Sansa, arms crossed, muscles taut with rage. Ilaria hovered near the back, worry etched on her face. Obara maintained a stoic guard by the door, her spear tip occasionally tapping the floor. Doran's voice was quiet, but each syllable cut like a knife. You came into my home, under the pretense of peace, and attempted to steal documents and threaten my family. Speak, or I'll let Obara demonstrate her spear work. Ser Lyle grimaced, blood soaking through the bandage on his arm. She said she wanted proof, orders, troop movements, anything to show the Lannisters how serious a threat Dorne could be if the realm broke into war again. Who is she? Lady Sanel? Doran's tone was clipped. Lyle nodded, anguish in his eyes. She's no cousin of Rosby. We only knew her as an agent, reporting to someone in the capital. Possibly Tywin Lannister, but she never said directly. Oberyn's lips curled. So Tywin sends a cutthroat in a lady's gown to gather secrets. And you, a knight sworn to him, do his bidding in my halls. He moved forward, voice dropping to a menacing hush. You put a blade to my wife. Ser Lyle swallowed hard, sweat beading on his brow. I had no choice. Oberyn's face twisted with fury. No choice. The same refrain from every coward who's done unspeakable acts. My sister's killers said the same. Doran raised a hand, a silent caution to Oberyn. Then he addressed Lyle. Where was Lady Sanel planning to go? I don't know, Lyle stammered. We had a rendezvous with the Ironwoods, but only for show. She has her own route. She might try to return to King's Landing with whatever she found, or to one of Tywin's lesser holds. Doran exhaled, rolling his chair back slightly. You found no chance to kill her, Obara? Obara's expression hardened. She dodged me and slashed my arm. She moves like a trained fighter, not like a lady. I gave chase, but she mounted a horse and fled. Silence stretched, thick with tension. At last, Doran addressed a guard. Take this man to a secure cell. He'll be questioned further. We'll decide his fate after we've gleaned all we can." Ser Lyle's eyes darted around. "I'll talk. I'll tell you anything. Just, please, I don't want to die." No one replied. The guards hauled him out, leaving the Solar in grim disquiet. Oberyn turned to Sansa, voice tight with concern. "You sure you're unharmed?" She nodded shakily. "He didn't cut me, just threatened." Ilaria stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Sansa's arm. "Come, you should rest. That was a terrible fright." Sansa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, blinking back tears. "I'm all right," she repeated, almost as if convincing herself. Then she turned to Doran. "I'm sorry. I followed her. I should have been more careful." Doran's gaze was understanding. "You showed initiative. Don't apologize. If anyone should be sorry, it's the Lannisters for daring to violate Goose. Right in our domain." His face hardened. "She won't get far. The desert nights can be brutal, and we have men who know these lands well." Oberyn placed a hand on Sansa's back, guiding her gently from the Solar. She was unsteady, her thoughts swirling. She could still feel the ghost of that dagger at her side. But beneath the fear, a spark of defiance flickered. Tywin had tried to pry secrets from Dorne, tried to menace her into silence. He had failed. That night, as she lay in bed beside Oberyn, her eyes refused to close. The memory of Ser Lyle's sneer haunted her. But so did the memory of Oberyn's fierce protection. She felt his arm around her, sensed the tension in his body as he stayed awake, too watchful. In the darkness, she whispered, "We won't let them win." His grip tightened. Never. When sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of a wolf and a viper prowling side by side through a desert under a blood-red sun. In her dream, they were not enemies, but companions, each lending the other strength. And when she woke at dawn, she carried that image with her, determined to keep forging her own path, with or without the Lannisters' mercy. She might be Sansa Stark, she might be Sansa Martell, but she would never again be a frightened pawn. The realm was vast, full of shifting sands and hidden dangers, but she had found the will to stand firm, to defend what she held dear. In the days that followed, Dorne buzzed with the aftermath of the infiltration attempt. The Ironwoods disavowed any knowledge of Lady Sinel's real identity, swearing they had been duped. Ser Lyle's confessions pointed to a network of spies stretching from the Crownlands through the Reach. The palace guards were doubled, and Prince Doran's intelligence networks scoured the countryside for any sign of Sinel. No certain word came of her fate, whether she escaped to a Lannister stronghold or perished in the harsh wastes of Dorne. Yet in Sunspear, a kind of solidarity strengthened. The Martells closed ranks, ensuring that no further infiltration would catch them by surprise. Sansa was not left alone anymore at odd hours. Oberyn or one of the Sand Snakes usually accompanied her, though it was done discreetly. She found comfort in their protectiveness, but also in the realization that she was valued here. They took measures to keep her safe because she mattered, not just as a political piece, but as a member of their family. When Sansa walked the palace corridors now, servants bowed with genuine respect. Courtiers welcomed her to their gatherings. She sensed that her bravery in confronting the spy, small though it was, had earned her a measure of admiration. Even Obara, who had been somewhat standoffish, clapped Sansa on the shoulder one afternoon and said, "Next time, carry a dagger. Makes it easier to defend yourself." Sansa accepted the advice with a small smile. She thought of how life had changed. Once, she had been so fearful she could barely speak in Joffrey's presence. Now, she was learning to navigate a world of shifting alliances, spies, and potential war, and she had chosen not to be powerless. She still thought often of Arya, wondering if her sister faced similar dangers alone, or if she, too, had found allies. She prayed that Arya's stubborn defiance kept her alive somewhere, forging her own path. In the hush of her chambers, she whispered, "Stay alive, little sister. We'll find each other." Meanwhile, Oberyn and Doran worked tirelessly to prepare for the uncertain future. Rumors abounded that Myrcella Baratheon might soon arrive in Dorne, that she might be betrothed to Trystane Martell to cement an alliance. Tywin's infiltration attempt hinted that he considered Dorne's involvement crucial to any new war, and the realm still teetered on the brink of chaos. Stannis Baratheon lurked in the shadows, the Iron Islands were restless, and the Boltons were said to tighten their grip on the north, sowing fear among the remnants of Stark loyalists. One evening, in the privacy of their chamber, Oberyn gathered Sansa's hands in his. "I want to ask you something," he said, searching her eyes. "If war does break out again, if Tywin attempts to force our hand, will you stand with Dorne?" There was no accusation in his voice, only an earnest question. She inhaled, her mind drifting to Winterfell, the Starks, her father's memory. Then she looked at Oberyn, the man who had saved her from the Lannisters' machinations, who had fought for her, who had given her a place where she could grow. And she thought of the people of Dorne, how they had accepted her, taught her, protected her. "Yes," she said softly, "I will, but not just because I'm your wife, because I believe in what Dorne represents: freedom, resilience, and justice for old wrongs." His lips curved into a faint smile, relief and affection mingling in his expression. "Then we shall stand together, a viper and a wolf, defending what we love." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, closing her eyes. In that moment, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. She was no longer merely Sansa Stark of Winterfell, nor was she just the lady of House Martell. She was both and more. The realm would continue to shift and quake around them, but she had found a core of strength, forged from the ashes of her past and the fire of Dornish resolve. She would hold on to that no matter what storms the future brought. And in the nights when she dreamed, she saw the sun rising over desert sands, over the broken walls of Winterfell, and she knew that the road ahead, long and perilous, was one she would walk willingly, side by side with the Red Viper of Dorne.